Imagine sitting in a dimly lit temple in Egypt, thousands of years ago, listening to a priest tell you that everything you thought you knew about history was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not off by a few generations. Wrong by thousands of years. That's exactly what happened to a Greek traveller named Solon, and the story he brought home would eventually be written down by Plato, sparking a mystery that scholars are still arguing about today. Here's the claim that started it all. According to Plato, Egyptian priests told Solon about a great civilization that existed 9,000 years before their own time. Not 900 years, not 90 generations, 9,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than writing itself as far as we know. It would place this mystery civilization somewhere around 9,600 BCE, deep in a period we associate with hunter-gatherers just beginning to experiment with agriculture, not with sophisticated societies capable of the achievements Plato describes. If you're listening to this while drifting off to sleep, let me know where in the world you are and what time it is right now. I love reading through the comments and realizing someone's hearing this story at sunrise in Tokyo, while someone else is falling asleep at midnight in Toronto. It's strange and wonderful knowing this same tale about ancient Egypt is echoing into so many different time zones at once. Now the Egyptian priests weren't just handing Solon a random number. According to Plato's account, they were essentially scolding the Greeks for being children when it came to history. They claim to have written records, actual archives, stretching back thousands of years, while Greek civilization, in their eyes, kept getting wiped out and starting over. It's a bold claim. It's also the exact claim that would eventually give birth to one of the most famous legends in Western history, the lost civilization of Atlantis. But here's where things get complicated, and where our investigation really begins. Was this 9,000-year timeline meant to be taken literally, or was something lost in translation somewhere between Egyptian record-keeping, Greek retelling, and Plato's own philosophical purposes? Because Plato wasn't just a historian jotting down facts. He was a philosopher building arguments about justice, about the ideal state, about how civilizations rise and fall. Did he use this Egyptian story as a factual account, or did he shape it, exaggerate it, maybe even invent parts of it to make a philosophical point? This is the central question we're going to spend this entire investigation trying to answer. Was Plato describing real history, filtered through centuries of retelling and translation? Was it mythology dressed up as fact? Was it a chronological error, a mistranslation of Egyptian numbering systems that got wildly inflated somewhere along the way? Or was it something else entirely? A genuine folk memory, distorted but real, of catastrophic events that actually happened around the end of the last ice age? To answer these questions, we're not going to rely on speculation alone. We're going digging. We'll examine what Plato actually wrote, word for word, and compare it against what we know about Solon and his journey to Egypt. We'll look at the city of Sais, where this story supposedly originated, and the priests of the goddess Neith, who allegedly kept these ancient records. We'll dig into Egyptian chronology itself, into flood myths from multiple cultures, into archaeology from Santorini to the Atlantic coastline, and into what geologists know about sea levels and catastrophic events at the end of the Pleistocene. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into history's greatest mysteries, the best way to support what we do here is to follow the show on Spotify. Listen there, and if you enjoy it, leave a 5-star review. The link is right in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's start where this whole mystery begins, with one Greek lawgiver, one Egyptian temple, and a story that would echo through history for over 2,000 years. Let's get specific about what Plato actually wrote, because this matters enormously. Every single thing we know about Atlantis, every single detail that's launched 1,000 documentaries, 1,000 pseudo-archaeological expeditions, and at least a few genuinely embarrassing History Channel specials comes from exactly 2 texts. 2 dialogues written by one philosopher in ancient Greece. That's it. That's the entire ancient source material. Everything else, every map, every theory, every claim about crystal technology or advanced Atlantean civilization, that's all been added later by people who were not Plato and who did not have access to any additional information he didn't already give us. The 2 texts are called the Timaeus and the Critias, and they were written sometime around 360 BCE. Think about that gap for a second. If the Egyptian priests really did tell Solon this story, and if Solon really did bring it back to Greece, we're talking about information that supposedly travelled from ancient Egypt to Solon around 600 BCE, then sat around in Greek oral tradition or family records for roughly 2 centuries before Plato finally wrote it down. That's a lot of opportunity for details to shift, get exaggerated, or simply be invented somewhere along the way. In the Timaeus, Plato sets up the story through a character named Critias, who claims he's about to share an account that's, quote, not a fictitious tale, but a genuine history. That's a bold claim to put right up front. And it's exactly the kind of claim that should make any careful investigator sit up and pay attention. Because when someone insists really hard that they're not making something up, that's often when the most interesting questions begin. According to Critias, this story had been passed down through his own family for generations. His account traces back to his great-grandfather, who supposedly heard it directly from Solon himself. Solon, if you'll remember from our last section, was the Athenian statesman and lawgiver who travelled to Egypt sometime around 600 BCE, decades before Plato was even born. So the chain of transmission Plato presents looks something like this. Egyptian priests to Solon, Solon to Critias's great-grandfather, that information passed down through the family to young Critias, and finally Critias to Plato, who wrote it all down roughly 240 years after Solon's original visit. Now, where exactly did this conversation between Solon and the priests supposedly happen? According to Plato, it took place in the city of Sais, in the Nile Delta region of Lower Egypt. Sais was home to a temple dedicated to the goddess Neith, an ancient Egyptian deity associated with wisdom, war, and creation. And according to Critias's account, the priests there weren't just casually chatting with a visiting Greek tourist. They were making a pointed, almost condescending comparison between Greek and Egyptian civilization. Here's roughly how the priest's argument goes, according to Plato. When Solon tried to share what he considered ancient Greek history, tales of early heroes, early floods, early kings, the Egyptian priests essentially laughed him off. One priest reportedly told him, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek. Imagine hearing that. You've travelled hundreds of miles by sea. You're proud of your homeland's history and legends, and a priest in a foreign temple tells you that your entire civilization's memory is basically kindergarten level compared to what his people have recorded. The priest goes on to explain why, according to the account, Egypt had been spared the kind of catastrophic destructions that periodically wiped out other civilizations. Greece, and really the rest of the world, had supposedly been struck repeatedly by great floods and fires that destroyed cities, scattered populations, and erased written records. Every time this happened, according to the priests, survivors had to essentially start over, rebuilding society from scratch, and losing all memory of what came before. But Egypt, protected by the unique geography of the Nile Valley, had never suffered this kind of total destruction. Its temples supposedly held written records stretching back thousands of years, giving the Egyptians a continuous memory that no other civilization on Earth could match. This is the philosophical setup for the big reveal. The priest tells Solon that, according to Egyptian temple records, there was a war fought 9,000 years before that time, meaning 9,000 years before Solon's visit around 600 BCE. That's the number, 9,000 years. And who was this ancient war fought between? On one side stood a version of Athens, but not the Athens Solon knew. This was, according to the priest, a much older Athens, a prehistoric city-state that had existed 9 millennia earlier, with its own laws, its own social structure, and apparently a level of civic virtue that Plato clearly admired. On the other side stood the forces of Atlantis, described as a massive island empire located beyond what the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, which we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. According to this account, Atlantis had grown into an enormous naval power, controlling territories not just on its home island, but stretching across parts of Libya and Europe as well. The Atlantean kings supposedly grew arrogant and aggressive, launching a campaign of conquest that threatened to subjugate the entire Mediterranean world. And it was prehistoric Athens, according to Plato's narrative, that stood virtually alone against this invasion, eventually defeating the Atlantean forces and liberating the peoples they had subjugated. Then, in a dramatic and honestly kind of abrupt turn, both prehistoric Athens and the island of Atlantis were destroyed. Plato describes violent earthquakes and floods striking in a single terrible day and night, during which the Athenian army was swallowed by the earth, and Atlantis itself sank beneath the sea, disappearing entirely. Now here's where we need to slow down and be really careful about what we're dealing with. This entire story, the ancient Athens, the war, the sinking island, comes to us wrapped inside a philosophical dialogue. Plato wasn't writing a history book. He was writing works of philosophy, using the framework of storytelling to explore ideas about the ideal state, about hubris and divine justice, about how even the most powerful civilizations can fall when they abandon virtue for ambition. The Critias dialogue, which was supposed to go into much greater detail about Atlantis itself, its geography, its architecture, its society, actually breaks off mid-sentence. Plato never finished it. We don't know if he intended to complete it later, abandoned the project, or if the ending was simply lost over the centuries of manuscript copying that separates us from the original text. This matters because so much of what people today associate with Atlantis, the concentric rings of water and land, the orichalcum metal, the advanced technology, all of that limited additional detail actually does come from Plato's own writing in the Critias, but it represents the full extent of ancient source material. There is no other ancient author, no other Egyptian inscription, no other independent Greek account that confirms or elaborates on this story. Everything beyond Plato's text, the countless books, theories and documentaries claiming to reveal the true location or technology of Atlantis, that's all later speculation built on a foundation of just 2 incomplete dialogues. So before we go any further, chasing floods, sunken islands, and lost civilizations, we need to understand the man who supposedly carried this story out of Egypt in the first place, and ask just how reliable his journey and his sources really were. So the entire Atlantis story rests on one man standing at the center of an enormous gap in time. Solon. Not Plato himself. Not an Egyptian inscription we can still read. Not some newly discovered papyrus pulled from a tomb. Solon, an Athenian statesman who lived roughly 2.5 centuries before Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias. And Solon was not some random traveller whose name got attached to the story later because it sounded impressive. He was one of the most famous Athenians who ever lived. Born probably around 630 BCE, and dying sometime around 560 BCE, Solon was a poet, politician, reformer, and lawgiver. Ancient Greeks counted him among their 7 sages, a kind of all-star lineup of early thinkers whose sayings were supposed to contain concentrated wisdom for living well. But Solon lived in an Athens that was in serious trouble. The city was divided between rich landowners and poor farmers. Debt was crushing ordinary people. Some Athenians were being enslaved because they couldn't repay what they owed. The wealthy controlled political power. The poor were angry. And everybody could see where this was heading: civil conflict, maybe revolution, maybe a tyrant seizing control. So around 594 BCE, Solon was appointed archon, one of Athens' highest officials with extraordinary authority to reform the system before the whole thing came apart. He cancelled many debts. He ended the practice of debt slavery for Athenian citizens. He reorganized political participation according to wealth rather than noble birth alone. He created legal structures that gave more citizens a role in public life, while still preserving privileges for the rich. It wasn't modern democracy, not even close. Women, enslaved people, and foreign residents remained excluded. But Solon helped create the political foundations from which Athenian democracy would eventually grow. Think of him as a man trying to repair a ship while it's already taking on water. He couldn't satisfy everyone. The wealthy thought he had gone too far. The poor thought he hadn't gone far enough, which, honestly, is usually how you know someone may have attempted a genuine compromise. After introducing his reforms, ancient tradition says Solon left Athens and travelled. He reportedly wanted to give his laws time to settle in without being pressured to rewrite them every time one angry faction complained. Whether every detail of that story is true is difficult to prove. Ancient biographies love a neat moral lesson. But Solon was also a poet and a public figure with connections across the eastern Mediterranean. Travel was entirely possible for someone in his position. And this is where Egypt enters the story. Several ancient writers associate Solon with a journey to Egypt. Plato has him visit the Egyptian city of Sais, where priests supposedly revealed the story of ancient Athens and Atlantis. Later writers, including Plutarch, expand on that tradition. Plutarch says Solon spent time in Egypt, speaking with priests at Sais and Heliopolis, and that he intended to turn the Atlantis account into a long poem after returning to Athens. That last detail is almost painful if you're interested in lost ancient texts. According to Plato's Critias, Solon brought the story home and began putting it into verse, but never finished it. In other words, there may have been a Solonian Atlantis poem, or there may have been a family tradition that later claimed there had been one. Either way, nothing survives, and that's the first major problem. We have surviving fragments of Solon's poetry, not complete books, not thousands of lines, but enough to hear his voice directly. He wrote about justice, politics, wealth, old age, the dangers of greed, the tension between order and chaos in a city. He sounds exactly like the kind of person Plato would want at the beginning of an Atlantis story. A wise lawgiver, a defender of civic balance, a man who understood that societies collapse when powerful people become arrogant. But among the surviving fragments, there is no Atlantis. No ancient war between Athens and a Western empire. No Egyptian priest telling Greeks that they were children. No island swallowed by the sea. Now, absence isn't proof. Ancient literature survives in ruins. We have only a fraction of what was written in the ancient world, and an even smaller fraction of what was ever copied. Solon could have written something about Egypt that simply vanished. He could have told a story orally that was never written down. But the silence still matters, because Plato is asking us to believe that the most spectacular historical revelation in Greek literature was preserved for generations without any independent trace outside his own dialogue. That's not impossible. It is just not the kind of evidence historians can treat as secure. Still, Solon's Egyptian journey is not some wildly absurd invention on its face. Greeks of Solon's era were increasingly connected to Egypt. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Greek merchants, mercenaries, sailors, and craftsmen were moving through the eastern Mediterranean in growing numbers. Egypt was not a sealed-off land of pyramids and priestly secrets. It was a major power, deeply involved in the trade routes and political struggles of the age. The Egyptian city of Naucratis in the Nile Delta had become a major Greek trading settlement by Solon's time, or very close to it. Greek ships were arriving with wine, olive oil, silver, pottery, and luxury goods. They returned with grain, papyrus, linen, perfumes, and Egyptian crafts. Greeks served in Egyptian armies. Egyptian rulers hired foreign soldiers. Ideas travelled with the cargo, and if you were a Greek intellectual, Egypt had a particular kind of prestige. Greece had ancient sanctuaries, heroic legends, and local traditions reaching back centuries. But Egypt had temples older than anything most Greeks could imagine. Monumental stone buildings, vast priesthoods, records written in a script almost no Greek could read. Kings whose claimed ancestry stretched back through lists and lists of predecessors. To a Greek visitor, Egypt could feel like a civilization that had been old before Greece was even born. That doesn't mean Egyptian priests necessarily possessed accurate records from 9,000 years earlier. We'll have to examine that claim carefully. But it does explain why a Greek like Solon might seek them out. He wasn't just looking for exotic stories. He was interested in laws, social order, religion, kingship, and the reasons states rise or fail. Egypt was a living archive of political and religious tradition, or at least it looked that way from across the sea. And Sais, the city Plato names, makes broad historical sense. Sais was in the western Nile Delta and was the home of the goddess Neith. During the Sais period, especially under Egypt's 26th dynasty, it became one of the kingdom's major political and religious centres. Egyptian rulers based at Sais had helped restore native Egyptian power after periods of foreign domination. They were active in Mediterranean trade and diplomacy. They had dealings with Greeks. The city wasn't some inaccessible temple complex hidden beyond the edge of the known world. It was located in precisely the part of Egypt where Greek contact was becoming most intense. So could Solon have gone to Egypt? Absolutely plausible. Could he have visited Sais? Also plausible. Could he have talked to Egyptian priests who shared stories about catastrophes, ancient kings, floods, and the deep past? Again, entirely plausible. Priests everywhere tell visiting foreigners stories. Ancient priests especially, that was part of what temples did. They preserved ritual knowledge, local tradition, royal ideology, and accounts of the gods' dealings with humanity. But did priests at Sais give Solon a historically accurate account of a war in 9600 BCE between Athens and Atlantis? That is a much bigger claim, and it depends on a chain of transmission that gets shakier the closer you look at it. Plato's version is often simplified as Egyptian priests to Solon to Plato. But the actual chain is longer. Solon supposedly told the story to Dropides, a relative or close associate. Dropides passed it to Critias, the grandfather of the dialogue's speaker, also named Critias. The older Critias then told the tale to a young Critias during a family gathering, and that younger Critias is the character who recounts it in Plato's dialogue. So we're not hearing Solon, we're hearing Plato writing Critias, who claims to remember what his grandfather said he heard from another relative who had heard Solon tell a story he supposedly learned from Egyptian priests. It's like a message passed through several generations, except every person in the chain is dead by the time it reaches us, and the final version appears in a philosophical work designed to compare the ideal city with a powerful civilization corrupted by wealth. That doesn't automatically make it fiction. Family traditions can preserve real memories. Elite Athenian families did preserve genealogies, political stories, inherited friendships, and old poems. Solon was connected to the aristocratic world from which Plato and Critias emerged. A story associated with him could have circulated for generations. But it also means we have no way to check the crucial moments. We cannot ask the Egyptian priests what they said. We cannot inspect Solon's notes. We cannot compare his unfinished poem with Plato's narrative. We cannot know whether the tale changed as it moved from priest to traveller, traveller to family, family to philosopher. And that is why Solon matters so much. He is not proof that Atlantis existed. He is the hinge on which Plato's claim to historical authenticity turns. If Solon truly heard an Egyptian tradition, then the story may preserve something older than Plato. If the Solon connection was invented, embellished, or reshaped, then Atlantis begins to look less like recovered history and more like one of the most brilliant political myths ever written. To understand which possibility is stronger, we need to go where Plato says Solon went, into the Nile Delta, to the city of Sais, and to the priests of the goddess Neith. Sais stood in the western Nile Delta, in the low, watery country where the Nile broke apart into branches before reaching the Mediterranean. Today, its ruins are far less dramatic than the pyramids or the temples of Luxor. There is no towering monument that immediately tells you this was once one of Egypt's most important cities. Delta mud, shifting river channels, later construction, and thousands of years of human activity have buried much of its past. But in Solon's time, Sais was not obscure. It was powerful. This was the city called Sa el-Hagar in modern Egypt, and during the 26th dynasty, the Saite dynasty, it became the political heart of a revived Egyptian kingdom. From roughly 664 to 525 BCE, rulers based at Sais controlled Egypt during one of its last great periods of native independence, before the Persian conquest. And Solon's traditional lifetime fits directly into that world. This matters because Plato did not pick a random Egyptian city with an ancient-sounding name. He placed Solon in a real centre of royal power, religious authority, and Mediterranean contact. If a Greek visitor was going to encounter Egyptian priests who were used to foreign travellers, familiar with Greek merchants and mercenaries, and proud of their country's immense antiquity, Sais is exactly the kind of place where that could happen. And at the centre of Sais stood its great goddess, Neith. Neith was one of Egypt's oldest deities, although oldest in Egyptian religion doesn't mean simple. Over thousands of years, gods changed, merged, acquired new roles, and were worshipped differently in different places. Neith could be a goddess of war associated with the bow and arrows. She could be a protector. She could be connected to weaving, creation, royal power, and the cosmic forces that brought order out of chaos. In later Egyptian religious thought, Neith was sometimes imagined as so ancient that she existed before creation itself. She was a mother of gods, a creator who could bring the world into being without needing a male partner. That is the kind of divine resume that makes even Zeus look like he needs more experience. For the people of Sais, Neith was not just one deity among many. She was their city's great protector, its sacred identity, and the focus of its temple tradition. Plato has the Egyptian priest tell Solon that the Greeks worshipped Neith too, but under another name, Athena. That comparison was not completely arbitrary. Athena, like Neith, had associations with warfare, wisdom, protection of cities, and skilled craftwork. To Greek ears, the connection made sense. To Egyptians, identifying foreign gods with Egyptian gods was also familiar. Ancient Mediterranean peoples constantly did this. They met another culture's deity and asked, in effect, "Who is this in our language? Is your storm god like ours? Is your mother goddess like ours? Is your city protector another face of the same divine power?" So when Plato makes the priest of Neith speak to Solon about ancient Athens, he is building a bridge between the two cultures. Athens was the city of Athena. Sais was the city of Neith. The priest is not merely telling a Greek visitor that Egypt is older. He is telling him that Athens and Sais are linked by a shared goddess, and therefore by a shared destiny, reaching deep into time. It is a brilliant literary move, but it is also rooted in a real cultural setting. By the 6th century BCE, Greeks were not strangers in Egypt. Naucratis, the Greek trading settlement in the Delta, was nearby by Mediterranean standards. Greek pottery has been found in Egypt. Egyptian objects made their way into Greek sanctuaries and homes. Greek mercenaries fought for Egyptian kings. Egyptian art influenced Greek sculpture. Greek travellers admired Egyptian temples, Egyptian engineering, Egyptian rituals, and above all Egyptian claims about the age of their civilization. Imagine arriving from a Greek city where even the oldest visible buildings might belong to the distant age of heroes, then entering a country filled with monuments, tombs, temples, and royal names that seem to vanish backward forever. Egypt did not just look old, it had institutions dedicated to remembering that it was old, and temples were central to that memory. An Egyptian temple was not simply a place where people came to pray. It was an economic institution, a political institution, a ritual centre, a storehouse, a workplace, and in some cases an archive. Temples owned land. They employed labourers, they managed supplies. They received offerings. Priests performed elaborate daily rituals for the gods. Scribes copied texts, maintained accounts, recorded donations, documented land holdings, preserved liturgies, and sometimes compiled king lists and local histories. The Egyptian priesthood was not one single organisation with one library containing all knowledge. Different temples had their own traditions, their own texts, their own sacred landscapes, and their own political interests. But collectively, Egyptian temples preserved writing on a scale that impressed the ancient world. That does not mean every temple maintained a perfectly continuous archive, reaching unchanged across 10,000 years. This is where the Atlantis claim gets difficult. Egyptian civilization itself was already extraordinarily ancient by Solon's day. The first Egyptian dynasties began around 3100 BCE. The pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,000 years old. Some temple traditions and sacred sites reached back even further, into the prehistoric cultures that existed along the Nile, before pharaohs ruled a unified kingdom. For a Greek in 600 BCE, that was almost unimaginable depth. Greece had ancient traditions, yes, but Egypt had monuments from what felt like the dawn of time. Still, 9600 BCE is another category entirely. That date sits more than 6,000 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. It is thousands of years before Egypt developed hieroglyphic writing. It is deep in the early Holocene, an age when people in the Nile Valley lived in small communities, adapting to changing climates, rivers, wetlands, and seasonal resources. There were no pharaohs, no stone temples like those later Egyptians built, no known state archives, no evidence of a literate Egyptian priesthood making annual records of Mediterranean wars. Could stories from that far back have survived orally? In principle, oral traditions can preserve memories for astonishing lengths of time. Some indigenous traditions may contain echoes of ancient sea level rise, volcanic eruptions, or landscape changes. But preserving a broad memory is not the same thing as preserving precise details. A named empire, a specific foreign city, a war, a political constitution, and a date thousands of years beyond the invention of writing. And physical archives are fragile. Egypt's dry climate preserved more writing than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. That is one reason we have papyri, inscriptions, administrative records, and religious texts at all. But temples burned, dynasties fell, libraries were neglected. Cities were sacked, archives were moved, copied, damaged, or simply lost. The Nile Delta, where Sais stood, is especially difficult. Its wet soil is far less friendly to papyrus than the dry desert cemeteries of Upper Egypt. Even if priests at Sais possessed old records, we should not picture a sealed vault containing untouched documents from 9600 BCE waiting patiently for Solon to arrive with a notebook. More likely, if there was any real tradition behind Plato's account, it would have been a mixture. Ancient Egyptian ideas about recurring destruction, temple genealogies, king lists extended into mythic time, memories of floods and vanished lands, stories adapted for foreign visitors. Maybe Greek stories entering Egypt and returning to Greece in Egyptian clothing. Maybe nothing more than Plato using Egypt's prestige to make a philosophical tale sound ancient and authoritative. That last possibility should not be dismissed too quickly. Plato's Egyptians do something very useful for Plato. They tell the Greeks that Greek civilization is young, forgetful, and repeatedly destroyed by catastrophe. They preserve the memory the Greeks lost. They praise ancient Athens as a city of courage and order. And they set up Atlantis as the opposite, rich, powerful, expansionist, morally corrupted and doomed. It is almost too perfect. The priests of Neith are not just characters standing in a temple. They are the voice of antiquity itself. When they speak, Plato gives his story the authority of a civilization Greeks already regarded as impossibly old and wise. He makes Egypt the witness. He makes Solon the receiver. He makes Athens the forgotten hero. But a believable setting is not the same thing as proof. Sais was real. Neith was real. Greek contact with the Delta was real. Egyptian temples did preserve written traditions and priestly learning. Greek visitors could absolutely have spoken with Egyptian priests about gods, ancient catastrophes, and the age of nations. What we do not have is independent Egyptian evidence for the conversation Plato describes. No inscription from Sais says that Solon came seeking ancient history. No surviving papyrus records the tale of Atlantis. No Egyptian text identifies a prehistoric Athens that defeated an Atlantic empire. No contemporary Greek source confirms that Solon returned with this extraordinary revelation. That silence does not prove the meeting never happened. Ancient evidence is full of silences. But it means the story cannot be treated as verified history simply because Plato placed it in a real city, before real priests, in a real period of Greek-Egyptian exchange. Sais gives the Atlantis account a credible doorway into Egypt. It does not tell us what was on the other side of that doorway. And to understand why the claim sounded so persuasive to Greek readers, we need to look at the larger question behind it. Why did Egypt seem so ancient, so authoritative, so close to the beginning of human memory, even to people living in one of the most intellectually confident civilizations on Earth? For a Greek reader, Egypt did not merely seem old. It seemed like the past was still alive there. Think about the difference in scale. Plato lived in the 4th century BCE, the Mycenaean palaces, the world later Greeks associated with Agamemnon, Troy, and the heroic age had collapsed roughly 800 years earlier. Classical Athens itself, with its democracy, naval empire, tragedy, philosophy, and public buildings, was younger still. The Parthenon had been completed less than a century before Plato wrote. Egypt, by comparison, could point to monuments already ancient when the Greek heroic age was supposedly taking place. The first unified Egyptian state emerged around 3100 BCE, nearly 3,000 years before Plato. The Great Pyramids at Giza were built around 2600 BCE. By Plato's lifetime, they were over 2,000 years old. That is like standing in modern Athens and looking at a building constructed before the rise of classical Greece, before Rome became an empire, before Christianity, before most of the written history people usually picture when they think of the ancient world. And the pyramids were not ruins in some forgotten wilderness. They were part of a landscape crowded with evidence of immense age. Temples had been rebuilt on older temples. Kings restored statues of kings who had restored statues of even earlier kings. Tombs named officials whose careers were already remote antiquity. Sacred sites claimed connections to the first time, the mythical moment when gods established order in the world. Egyptians lived surrounded by layers of their own past. A Greek city could preserve genealogies, heroic poems, old cults, and family traditions. But Egypt had something else: writing. Not just inscriptions carved on monuments, but administrative documents, religious texts, temple inventories, land records, royal names, and ritual formulas, copied generation after generation by scribes trained to preserve them. This gave Egyptian antiquity a physical weight. A priest could take a visitor past a statue with a king's name carved into stone. He could point to a temple wall listing royal ancestors. He could recite the succession of dynasties, explain which king built which monument, which god founded which sanctuary, and which ancient ritual had been performed since the age of the ancestors. Whether every detail was accurate by modern standards was almost beside the point. The tradition had depth. It had institutions behind it. It had buildings that appeared to have stood forever. And Egyptians were very good at presenting that depth. Their king lists are a perfect example. Some surviving lists, like those at Abydos and Saqqara, name long sequences of rulers stretching backward through centuries. Later, the Turin king list preserved an even more expansive tradition, including rulers whose reigns belonged partly to mythic time. These lists were not modern timelines. They did not exist to give impartial historians a clean, complete record. They could omit hated rulers, elevate favoured lines, and connect the reigning king to a sacred chain of legitimate authority. But they told a powerful story. Egypt had always had kings. Egypt had always had order. The present pharaoh was not an accident of politics. He was the latest guardian of a civilization rooted in the beginnings of the world, that mattered enormously in a land that had endured invasions, civil wars, regional divisions, and foreign rule. Egypt had not been politically unified without interruption for 3,000 years. Dynasties rose and fell. The country fractured and reunited. Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, Persian, and later Macedonian rulers all entered the story. Yet Egyptian culture had a remarkable ability to absorb disruption into continuity. A new ruler might restore an old temple. A later dynasty might imitate ancient artistic styles. A king who needed legitimacy could present himself as the restorer of Ma'at, the cosmic order that earlier rulers had protected. Even change could be described as a return to something timeless. To Greek visitors, this could look almost supernatural. Their own cities had experienced upheavals too. Tyrannies, revolutions, invasions, shifting alliances, colonies founded across the sea. Greek political life was dynamic, inventive, and often brutally unstable. Egypt, even when it was struggling, seemed to possess a deeper memory of how things were supposed to be. And Greek writers repeatedly noticed this. Herodotus, writing before Plato, described Egypt as a land of wonders, customs, and antiquity. He reported conversations with priests who gave him enormous figures for Egyptian history. In one famous passage, the priests at Thebes supposedly showed the Greek writer Hecataeus a long line of statues representing generations of high priests. Hecataeus had traced his own ancestry back 16 generations to a god. The Egyptian priests answered with hundreds of generations of their own. The message was not subtle. Greek family pride was impressive. Egyptian institutional memory was older. Herodotus also reported priestly claims that hundreds of Egyptian kings had ruled over more than 11,000 years. Modern historians do not accept such figures as literal, continuous chronology in the way we would date a reign today. The numbers are too large, and ancient systems of counting could combine human rulers, legendary ancestors, gods, and sacred eras. But that is exactly why these claims are important. Egyptian time was not always measured on one level. There was historical time, the reign of this king, the construction of that temple, the tax records from a particular year. Then there was sacred time, the age when gods ruled, when the world was ordered, when the first king received the crown, when the foundations of Egypt were laid. And between those two categories was a vast zone of ancestral tradition, local memory, legendary rulers, and events whose dates may have been uncertain even to the priests who recited them. When an Egyptian priest claimed that his civilization was unimaginably ancient, he may not have been lying in the simple sense. He may have been speaking in the language of temple tradition. Egypt's origins were ancient beyond ordinary memory, because Egypt as a sacred civilization was believed to reach back toward creation itself. But there was also prestige involved. Antiquity was power. If your temple was older, your god more primordial, your rituals more ancient, your records more complete, then your city had authority. In the ancient Mediterranean age was not just an interesting fact. It was a credential. A custom was respected because ancestors had followed it. A law was legitimate because it came from the founders. A priesthood commanded trust because it guarded knowledge inherited from the distant past. So, when Plato has an Egyptian priest tell Solon that Greece is young, he is using a cultural idea his audience would immediately understand. Egypt was the civilization that could make even proud Greeks feel like newcomers. And that authority did useful work in Greek writing. A Greek author could attribute a startling claim to Egyptian priests and give it an aura that the claim might not have carried on its own. Egypt became the keeper of lost knowledge, the place where records survived disasters that had erased the memories of other peoples, the civilization that remembered what Greece had forgotten. That does not mean Greek writers accepted every Egyptian claim uncritically. Greeks were curious, skeptical, competitive, and perfectly capable of treating foreign traditions as strange or exaggerated. But they also deeply admired Egyptian permanence. Egypt had colossal architecture. It had literacy. It had priestly specialists. It had a visible past reaching far beyond anything in the Greek landscape. So imagine hearing that priests at Sais possessed a record from 9,000 years before Solon. The number would have sounded extraordinary. But it would not have sounded impossible in the way it sounds to a modern historian. If any people could claim to remember the deep past, surely it would be the Egyptians. That is the psychological force behind Plato's story. But psychological force is not documentary proof. A priest's assertion could be a precise chronological statement. It could be a sacred number. It could reflect a conversion mistake between Egyptian and Greek units of time. It could be a temple tradition stretched into mythic antiquity. Or it could be a prestigious claim shaped to impress a foreign visitor. And now we have to confront the number itself, 9,000 years. Did Plato mean exactly what it appears to mean? 9,000 years. It is the number that turns Plato's story from an ancient legend into something almost impossible to place. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, who supposedly heard the account in Egypt, lived around the beginning of the 6th century BCE. Put his Egyptian journey somewhere near 600 BCE, give or take a few decades, and the calculation is brutally simple. 9,000 years before Solon takes us to roughly 9,600 BCE. Not 9,600 years ago from Plato's lifetime, Not 9,600 years before us. 9,000 years before a man living around 600 BCE. From our perspective, that is nearly 11,600 years ago. And that date matters because it lands right at the end of the last ice age. This is not the world of pharaohs. It is not the world of Minoan palaces, Mycenaean kings, or Troy. It is not even the world of farming villages in most of Europe. The pyramids are still more than 7,000 years in the future. Writing does not yet exist in Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, or anywhere else we know of. The first dynasties of Egypt are millennia away. If Plato's figure is literal, then the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis belongs to a world so remote that it predates recorded history by an enormous margin. That is why the number has such force. It does not merely make Atlantis old. It places Atlantis on the other side of a civilizational abyss. But almost as soon as people began taking Plato's story seriously, they found a possible escape route. What if the Egyptians did not mean years? What if the number had been translated incorrectly? The basic idea goes like this. Ancient cultures used different calendars. Some counted time in solar years. Some used lunar months. Some organized records by rains, seasons, festivals, or civil calendar cycles. A Greek visitor hears an Egyptian priest say 9,000 of something, assumes the unit is years, and carries that number back into Greek tradition. But perhaps the original Egyptian count referred to months, lunar periods, or some smaller unit of time. Turn 9,000 months into years, and the date changes dramatically. If you divide 9,000 months by 12, you get 750 years. Put that before Solon, and suddenly the event moves from around 9,600 BCE to around 1350 BCE. That is a completely different world. Now we are in the Late Bronze Age. Egypt has pharaohs. Crete has the memory of the Minoan world. Mycenaean Greece is rising toward its peak. Powerful kingdoms trade across the Mediterranean. Armies use bronze weapons. Palaces keep records on clay tablets. Seaborne empires can project force across long distances. And, most importantly for Atlantis theories, this revised date puts the story much closer to real disasters that later sections of this story will have to confront. The volcanic destruction of Thera, the decline of Minoan Crete, the wars and migrations of the Bronze Age collapse, the sea raiders who threatened Egypt itself. If 9,000 really meant 900, 750, or some other reduced figure, then Atlantis no longer needs to be an Ice Age super-civilization. It could become a distorted memory of a historical Mediterranean catastrophe. It is an attractive solution, maybe too attractive, because it appears to solve several problems at once. It brings the date into an era with ships, palaces, trade networks, and organized warfare. It makes the scale of Plato's narrative feel less absurd. It gives researchers actual archaeological cultures to compare with the story. Instead of searching for a vanished empire under Ice Age seas, you can look at Bronze Age Crete, Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, Iberia, or the Eastern Mediterranean. But the calendar conversion theory has serious weaknesses. First, Plato's Greek text says years. The priest in the dialogue does not say that 9,000 months passed. He says 9,000 years. Of course, Plato could have misunderstood an earlier source. Solon could have misunderstood the priest. An Egyptian interpreter could have mistranslated a technical term. There are several links in the chain where confusion could happen. But there is no surviving evidence that it did happen. No Egyptian document gives us an original version with months written where Plato later wrote years. No ancient commentator reports that Solon made a calendar mistake. No textual clue inside the dialogue tells us that the number is really a unit conversion waiting to be decoded. The theory is possible, That is not the same as demonstrated. Second, Egyptian priests were not naive about calendars. Egypt had one of the ancient world's most developed systems for measuring time. The Egyptian civil calendar divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 additional days at the end. Priests also watched the stars, tracked lunar cycles for religious observances, and maintained records tied to royal reigns and festivals. A priestly institution capable of preserving long chronological traditions would know the difference between a month and a year. So would educated Greeks. Greek cities used lunar calendars, but they absolutely understood that 12 lunar months made roughly 1 year. This was not an obscure scientific distinction that nobody had noticed. Third, even the arithmetic is less clean than it first appears. 9,000 lunar months are not exactly 750 solar years. A lunar month is about 29.5 days, so 9,000 lunar months equal roughly 727 solar years. That would move the event closer to about 1325 BCE, rather than precisely 1350 BCE. Still Bronze Age, yes, but the calculation is not a perfect key that unlocks one exact historical event. And why stop there? If we are free to convert years into months whenever a date seems inconvenient, then almost any ancient chronology can be pushed toward whatever period we prefer. 9,000 might become 750 years, or perhaps 900 years if a zero was added, or perhaps a sacred multiple, a rounded figure, or a symbolic expression of immense antiquity. Once we start adjusting the number, we have to ask what rule is guiding the adjustment. Evidence or desire? There is another problem. The same Egyptian priestly tradition in Plato gives other enormous time spans. Athens and Sais are both said to have been founded long before Solon's day. The priests describe repeated destructions of humanity by fire and flood. Their account is not presented as a neat political chronicle beginning with one event and ending with another. It is a deep time story, a story about civilizations rising, falling, and being forgotten. In that context, 9,000 years may be meant literally within the narrative, or it may be a large traditional number meant to place the events beyond ordinary Greek memory. But treating it as an accidental month-for-year error can feel less like reading the story on its own terms, and more like forcing it into a period we find easier to believe. So where does that leave us? A literal reading gives us around 9,600 BCE, near the end of the Ice Age. That date is archaeologically challenging if we imagine Plato describing a palace civilization with a vast empire and a great naval war. A revised reading can move the story into the Bronze Age, where historical parallels become easier to find. But the revision rests on an assumption we cannot prove, and it does not explain why Plato's account contains details that do not neatly fit any known Bronze Age event either. The number alone does not decide whether Atlantis was real. It does not prove that Egyptian archives preserved Ice Age history. It does not prove that Solon mistranslated a priest. And it does not turn a Minoan eruption, a Bronze Age war, or a later flood legend into Atlantis, simply by making the arithmetic more convenient. What it does do is open two radically different doors. Behind one is a world of melting ice sheets, rising seas, and human communities just beginning to transform their relationship with the land. Behind the other is the violent, interconnected world of Bronze Age kingdoms. And the first door opens at roughly 9,600 BCE. So what exactly was happening in the human story when Plato's date begins? Around 9,600 BCE, the planet was changing faster than any human being had ever seen. For thousands of years, the world had been locked in the final cold phase of the Ice Age. Massive ice sheets covered northern Europe and North America. So much water was trapped in glaciers that sea level stood more than 100 meters lower than it does today. Coastlines were pushed far outward. Places now under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the English Channel, and vast stretches of Southeast Asia were dry land. And then the Ice Age began to loosen its grip. The immediate backdrop was the end of the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that began around 10,900 BCE. After an earlier warming trend, temperatures in much of the northern hemisphere plunged again. In some regions, the climate may have shifted within decades. Forests retreated, rainfall patterns changed, animals moved or declined. Communities that had adapted to one landscape found themselves living in another. Then, around 9700 BCE, the Younger Dryas ended. Not with a single dramatic morning when the whole planet became warm, but rapidly enough to transform ecosystems within human lifetimes. Temperatures rose, glaciers began retreating again. Rivers changed course, grasslands expanded in some places, while other regions became wetter, warmer or less predictable. The long transition from the Pleistocene, the age of mammoths and ice sheets, into the Holocene, the geological era we still live in, was underway. That is the world Plato's literal date points toward. Not a blank world, not a world without people, but a world without anything we would normally recognize as a civilization. Human beings had already spread across much of the planet. Homo sapiens had reached Australia tens of thousands of years earlier. People lived across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. They hunted, gathered plants, fished, trapped small animals, made clothing, built shelters, buried their dead, traded valuable materials over long distances, and passed down detailed knowledge about landscapes that modern people can barely imagine surviving in. They knew the habits of migrating animals. They knew which plants healed, which poisoned, which seeds could be ground into food, and where water could be found when rivers failed. They made stone blades, bone tools, baskets, nets, cords, and probably wooden objects that almost never survive in the archaeological record. These were not primitive people in the sense of being mentally inferior. They were fully human people dealing with an extraordinarily difficult world. But their societies were generally small. In much of Europe, groups still lived as mobile hunter-gatherers, following seasonal resources across landscapes that were changing beneath their feet. In North Africa and Southwest Asia, people experimented with different ways of living as the climate shifted. Some remained highly mobile. Others began returning to the same favourable places year after year. Where wild cereals, nuts, fish, game and water were reliable, camps could become more permanent. And this is where the story gets interesting, because 9600 BCE was not yet the age of cities. But it was close to the beginning of changes that would eventually make cities possible. In the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region, including parts of modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon and Syria, the Natufian culture had already shown that hunter-gatherers could live in substantial settlements before farming fully emerged. Some communities built stone structures, stored food, processed wild grain, and buried their dead near or beneath houses. They were not living in tiny temporary camps all the time. They were beginning to settle down. The Younger Dryas may have disrupted many of these communities by making wild resources less dependable. But after the climate warmed again, new villages appeared. At places like Jericho, people began building more substantial houses and relying increasingly on cultivated plants. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas and other foods were being managed, selected, and eventually domesticated. This was the beginning of agriculture, but it was slow, painfully slow. Nobody woke up one day, planted a field, and invented civilization by lunchtime. For generations, People probably combined hunting, gathering, fishing, and cultivation. They tested plants, they saved seeds, they returned to the same valleys. They built houses, abandoned them, rebuilt them, and gradually became more tied to particular landscapes. The first farmers were not pharaohs. They were not kings. They did not have writing, coinage, bureaucracies, professional armies, or stone palaces. And yet they were crossing a threshold around this same period in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. People were building something that once seemed impossible for communities without cities, Göbekli Tepe. The earliest known monumental structures there date to roughly 9600 BCE, right around Plato's famous date. Huge T-shaped limestone pillars were erected in circular enclosures. Some pillars weigh many tons. They were carved with foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, and other animals. Building them required quarrying stone, moving it, shaping it, organizing labor, feeding workers, and maintaining a shared purpose strong enough to bring people together repeatedly. For a long time, the standard story ran in one direction. First agriculture, then permanent villages, then surplus food, then social hierarchy, then temples, monuments, and eventually cities. Göbekli Tepe complicated that story. It did not prove there was an Ice Age empire. It did not reveal lost writing or a vanished naval power. But it did show that hunter-gatherers and very early farming communities could organize large-scale communal projects much earlier than older textbooks had assumed. Maybe ritual gatherings helped pull scattered groups together. Maybe feasting, exchange, seasonal migration, and shared religious traditions created networks larger than a single village. Maybe the need to support those gatherings encouraged people to intensify food production. We still debate the exact sequence, but the old image of prehistoric people as isolated families wandering endlessly without complex beliefs, planning, or cooperation is simply wrong. That matters for Atlantis because it gives us two truths that have to be held together. First, people around 9600 BCE were capable of impressive things. They could build monuments, they could create symbolic art, they could maintain social networks across wide regions, they could preserve traditions orally over many generations, they could witness floods, changing shorelines, collapsing ecosystems, and the disappearance of familiar lands. Second, nothing currently found in the archaeological record supports Plato's specific picture of a vast maritime empire at that date. We have no confirmed Ice Age cities, no writing systems, no royal archives, no fleets of warships, no evidence of a state powerful enough to conquer lands across the Mediterranean and then fight a great organized war against an equally advanced Athens. And that distinction is crucial. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially near ancient coasts. As the ice sheets melted, sea level rose in stages over thousands of years. Entire coastal plains disappeared beneath the sea. Camps, villages, fishing grounds, river mouths, and perhaps important early settlements were drowned or buried under marine sediment. The people of 9600 BCE would have seen the map of their world changing. Not necessarily in one single global flood, but through relentless local disasters, shorelines advancing, salt water invading freshwater wetlands, storms reaching farther inland, lowlands becoming islands, and familiar hunting grounds vanishing beneath the waves. Some of their stories may have survived, distorted, transformed, and retold until no one could identify the original landscape. But submerged coastlines can explain missing settlements. They cannot automatically explain everything Plato describes. A lost village is not an empire. A drowned landscape is not proof of Atlantis. And a monumental sanctuary, however astonishing, is not the same thing as a city, a kingdom, or a civilization with writing and state power. Those things came much later. The first true cities emerged in Mesopotamia thousands of years after 9600 BCE. Writing appears later still, around the late 4th millennium BCE. The first Egyptian state, the world of the earliest pharaohs, formed around 3100 BCE. Greece's Bronze Age palaces came later again. Classical Athens, the Athens Plato knew, was separated from 9600 BCE by almost 10,000 years. So, if the Egyptian priests gave Solon a literal date, they were not describing history in the ordinary sense that we use the word. They were reaching into a time before archives, before kingdoms, before any surviving written memory. But it was not a time without human achievement. It was a time when the old Ice Age world was drowning, when new ways of living were taking root, and when small communities were beginning to do things that hinted at the immense transformations still to come. And that leaves us with an even sharper question. If Plato's date points to this deep prehistoric world, what exactly was the ancient Athens supposed to be? And Plato's answer is stranger than most people realize, because Atlantis was not the only lost civilization in the story. Long before the island empire sank beneath the sea, Plato says there was another great power. Not Egypt, not Minoan Crete, not Mycenae. It was Athens, an Athens almost 9,000 years older than Solon. According to the Egyptian priest in Plato's Timaeus, the Greeks remembered only fragments of their own past. They knew recent disasters, recent migrations, recent wars, but Egypt, protected by the Nile and its supposedly continuous written archives, remembered a far older age. An age when Athens was not a small city-state struggling against Persian invasion, Macedonian power, and its own political divisions. It was the defender of the whole Greek world, maybe even the defender of Europe and Asia. This ancient Athens stood against Atlantis when the Atlantean Empire pushed eastward from beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis had conquered much of Libya, meaning North Africa, and parts of Europe. Its armies threatened Egypt and Greece, and then, Plato says, Athens stepped forward, not as part of a massive coalition, not because another empire rescued it. Ancient Athens fought alone. It defeated a power larger, richer, and more aggressive than itself. It freed the peoples Atlantis had enslaved. Then, shortly afterward, earthquakes and floods destroyed both societies. Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. Athens, too, was swallowed by the earth, leaving no trace except the memory preserved in Egypt. Now, that sounds like straightforward national myth. Athens saves the world. Athens proves that courage and virtue can defeat wealth and imperial power. But Plato makes the point even more obvious in the details. His prehistoric Athenians are almost exactly the kind of citizens Plato wished existed in his own time. They are disciplined, moderate, united. They have no obsession with luxury. They do not chase wealth, flatter demagogues, or fight each other for power. Their warrior class lives simply, sharing common meals and holding property in common. Men and women receive the same training and serve the same civic purpose. The people who produce food and goods are separate from the guardians who defend the city. Everyone has a role. Everyone serves the whole. If this sounds familiar, it should. It is very close to the ideal city Plato describes in the Republic. In that dialogue, Plato imagines a society governed not by popular whim, inherited wealth, or ruthless ambition, but by wisdom, discipline, and a strict division of responsibilities. The guardians defend, the producers provide, the rulers govern according to reason. Personal desire is controlled for the sake of civic harmony. Then, in the Atlantis story, Plato appears to place that ideal city in the distant past and give it a historical enemy. Atlantis is the anti-Athens. Atlantis begins as a powerful and orderly kingdom. It has impressive engineering, fertile land, great harbours, palaces, canals, temples, armies, horses, ships, and enormous natural resources. But prosperity corrupts it. The Atlanteans become greedy. They lose their moral balance. Their divine inheritance is diluted by human weakness. They want more territory, more tribute, more control. And so the rich empire becomes unjust. Ancient Athens, by contrast, remains poor by comparison, but virtuous. It does not win because it has more gold. It wins because its citizens have mastered themselves. That is not a subtle contrast. It is philosophical architecture. Even Plato's description of ancient Attica seems designed to carry a moral message. He says the land around Athens was once far more fertile than it was in his own day. Attica, the region surrounding Athens, had rich soil, forests on the hills, abundant pastures, springs, rivers, and productive farmland. The Acropolis itself was supposedly much larger, inhabited by the warrior class, and surrounded by land capable of supporting a far greater population. But over thousands of years, Plato says, the soil had washed away. He compares Attica in his own time to the skeleton of a sick body. The rich earth was gone. The mountains had been stripped bare. What remained was thin, rocky ground, the hard remnant of a once fertile country. That observation was not completely invented. Soil erosion was a real concern in the ancient Mediterranean. Deforestation, grazing, farming, and changing land use could damage landscapes. And Attica may indeed have looked more barren in some periods than it had in others. But Plato pushes the image far beyond simple environmental observation. The land has declined, just as the city has declined. The old Athens was fertile, disciplined, and virtuous. The later Athens is poorer, politically unstable, and forgetful of its origins. In Plato's lifetime, Athens had suffered catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War. It had seen oligarchic coups, democratic turmoil, executions, imperial ambition, and the death of Socrates. Plato had watched his city make disastrous choices, then punish one of its most famous philosophers. So when he describes a lost Athens governed by order and courage, he is not only talking about prehistory, he is talking about the Athens he wished he had, and this is where the story becomes difficult for anyone trying to treat Atlantis as literal history. People often ask, where was Atlantis? What island sank? What coastal city lies under the sea? What disaster could explain the legend? But ancient Athens presents the same problem, maybe an even bigger one. If Plato's date is literal, this ideal Athens existed around 9600 BCE, yet there is no archaeological evidence for a city-state in Attica at that time. No Acropolis settlement, no organized army, no class system like Plato describes, no monumental civic architecture, no traces of a society capable of defeating a trans-Mediterranean empire. And unlike a hypothetical Atlantis beyond Gibraltar, Attica is not hidden in the middle of the Atlantic. It has been studied for generations. Yes, prehistoric sites can be destroyed. Coastlines drown, soil erodes. Later cities build over earlier ones. But Plato's ancient Athens is not merely a village that might have vanished beneath sediment. It is a fully formed political ideal projected thousands of years into the past. That does not prove every element of the story was invented from nothing. Plato may have drawn on Egyptian traditions, Greek flood myths, real memories of environmental change, and older stories of conflict. But the Athens that defeats Atlantis looks less like an excavated civilization and more like a thought experiment. A perfect city tested by a corrupt empire. And if ancient Athens is philosophical, then Atlantis may be philosophical too. And that brings us to the place itself. Not Atlantis as a vague, lost city under the waves. Not the later image of crystal towers, submarines, and impossible machines. Plato gives us something much more specific. An island empire. And he places it beyond the Pillars of Heracles. For a Greek reader, the Pillars of Heracles meant the narrow gateway at the western edge of the Mediterranean, almost certainly the Strait of Gibraltar. On one side was southern Iberia, on the other was North Africa. Beyond that narrow passage stretched the vast outer sea, the Atlantic Ocean, a place Greeks knew existed, but did not fully understand. This location matters. Plato is not placing Atlantis in the Aegean, not near Crete, not beside Egypt, not in some hidden corner of the Mediterranean where a city might have slipped beneath the water unnoticed. He says it was outside the familiar world, beyond the Gate of Gibraltar, in the ocean, and it was enormous. In the dialogue Critias, Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia together. Now, those terms did not mean modern Africa and modern Asia. Libya meant North Africa west of Egypt. Asia usually meant Asia Minor, much of modern Turkey. Even so, this is an extraordinary claim. Plato is describing an island or landmass on a continental scale. Then he adds another strange detail. Beyond Atlantis, he says, there were other islands. And beyond those islands lay a larger continent surrounding what he calls the true ocean. To some modern readers, that sounds almost prophetic. Was Plato somehow describing the Americas? Probably not. Greek writers had long speculated about unknown lands in the outer ocean. The point is not that Plato possessed a map of the New World. The point is that Atlantis stood at the threshold between the known Mediterranean world and an imagined Western realm of immense distances and unknown possibilities. But Atlantis was not described as primitive or mysterious. It was engineered. Picture the capital. At its centre stood a hill, the place where, according to Plato's myth, the god Poseidon had joined with a mortal woman named Cleito. Poseidon supposedly reshaped the land around that hill into alternating rings of sea and land. 3 rings of water, 2 rings of earth, a circular fortress at the centre, protected by water barriers and connected by bridges. It is one of the most memorable images in all ancient literature. A city built like a target, or like the ripples that spread from a stone dropped into water. The Atlanteans cut canals through the rings, they built bridges over them. They created harbours where ships could pass inward toward the central island. Plato describes walls faced with different metals, temples covered in precious materials, docks crowded with vessels, barracks, markets, royal buildings, and a vast temple of Poseidon. Inside that temple stood a colossal statue of the god driving a chariot, surrounded by winged horses and sea creatures. It is grand. It is excessive, almost deliberately excessive. And beyond the capital lay the island's agricultural heartland, a huge rectangular plain, surrounded by mountains and crossed by canals. Plato gives it measurements, as if he wants us to imagine surveyors pacing it out. The plain was about 3,000 stadia long and 2,000 wide. Depending on how you calculate the Greek stadion, that could mean something like 550 kilometres by 370 kilometres. That is not a small fertile valley around a Bronze Age palace. That is a landscape large enough to support a major state. The soil, Plato says, produced 2 harvests a year. One nourished by winter rains, another fed by irrigation in summer. The mountains supplied timber, animals, minerals, and pasture. The island had elephants. It had horses. It had shipbuilding material. It had a mysterious metal called orichalcum, described as glowing like fire. Maybe orichalcum was based on a real copper alloy, perhaps brass. Maybe it was a legendary substance, like something halfway between bronze and gold. Either way, It tells you what Plato wants Atlantis to represent. Not just survival, abundance. The Atlanteans possessed everything a state could want. Fertile farmland, mines, forests, harbours, trade, armies, naval power, and the ability to turn natural wealth into imperial force. This is where the city becomes an empire. Plato says the kings of Atlantis ruled not only their own island, but many other islands and parts of the mainland. Their power extended into the Mediterranean world. They controlled Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrannia, a region associated with Western Italy. Think about what that means. An Atlantic power has pushed through Gibraltar, taken North African territory, reached toward Italy, and now threatens Greece and Egypt. This is not an isolated island kingdom. It is a superpower expanding eastward into the heart of the ancient world. And that expansion brings Atlantis into conflict with ancient Athens. According to the Egyptian account Plato puts in the mouth of Critias, Atlantis tried to enslave the peoples inside the Mediterranean. Egypt was threatened. Greece was threatened. Other peoples had already been conquered. Athens alone resisted, defeated the invaders, and liberated those under Atlantean rule. Again, the message is almost impossible to miss. Atlantis has wealth, territory, fleets, numbers, and resources. Athens has discipline and virtue. One is driven by appetite, the other by self-control, but Plato does not say Atlantis began as evil. That is important. At first, the Atlanteans were orderly. Their rulers obeyed laws said to come from Poseidon. They met in ritual councils, they judged disputes. They sacrificed bulls, swore oaths, and governed according to a sacred code. As long as the divine part of their nature remained strong, Plato says they used their prosperity wisely. Then the balance changed. Generation after generation, their divine inheritance became diluted. Their human impulses became stronger. They stopped valuing virtue over power. They became intoxicated by luxury. They wanted dominion over everyone else. It is the oldest political warning in the world. A society becomes rich. Riches create confidence. Confidence becomes entitlement. Entitlement becomes conquest. And eventually a state powerful enough to dominate its neighbours begins believing that power itself is proof of moral superiority. Plato had seen versions of that story in his own lifetime. Athens had built an empire. Athens had demanded tribute. Athens had invaded Sicily in a spectacular gamble for wealth and influence. And Athens had paid for it. So Atlantis may be ancient in setting, but its anxiety is very Greek. What happens when a successful society loses its limits? Then comes the ending everyone remembers. After Athens defeats the invading empire, Plato says there were violent earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night of misfortune, the Athenian warriors were swallowed by the earth. Atlantis too sank beneath the sea, gone. Not gradually abandoned, not defeated over centuries, not reduced to ruins waiting for archaeologists to uncover them, destroyed in one catastrophic convulsion of nature. This detail has fueled Atlantis speculation for more than 2,000 years. Earthquakes are real. Tsunamis are real. Coastal cities have been submerged. Volcanic eruptions have devastated islands. Sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age, drowning entire prehistoric landscapes. But none of that is evidence for Plato's Atlantis. There is no known island beyond Gibraltar matching his description. No archaeological evidence for a vast Atlantic empire ruling North Africa and Europe around 9,600 BCE. No trace of the enormous capital, its ringed canals, its imperial administration, or its war against a prehistoric Athens. And there is another problem. Critias, the dialogue containing the fullest description, breaks off before the story is finished. Zeus is about to address the gods and punish Atlantis for its corruption. Then the text simply ends. Whether Plato never completed it, or whether the ending was lost, we do not know. So the most detailed Atlantis account we possess is also an unfinished work. That does not mean Plato invented every image without any source material. The rings of water may echo real harbours. The fertile plain may reflect Egypt, Mesopotamia, or stories of distant lands. The catastrophe may preserve memories of floods, earthquakes, or vanished coastlines. The imperial war may draw on Greek experiences of Persia, Athens, and other expanding powers. But the detailed imagery is evidence of Plato's imagination and literary skill. It is not, by itself, evidence that an Atlantic empire existed. And once you see Atlantis as a place built from moral contrasts, political fears, geographic speculation, and disaster memory, the next question becomes unavoidable. Was Plato reporting an ancient Egyptian record? Or was he constructing the most elaborate philosophical warning ever written? For most classicists, the answer is yes. Atlantis is primarily Plato's invention. Not necessarily invented from nothing, not necessarily a random fantasy with no connection to real places, real disasters, or real political events. But the story as we have it, the island empire, the perfect prehistoric Athens, the moral collapse, the war, and the final destruction, looks very much like a philosophical construction. A story designed to make an argument, and once you look at where Atlantis appears, that conclusion becomes hard to avoid. It appears in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These are not travel journals. They are not Egyptian inscriptions copied word for word. They are philosophical conversations written by Plato, in which characters discuss the nature of the universe, human society, government, virtue, and decline. Timaeus begins with a question that matters more than it might seem. Socrates has just described an ideal state. He wants to see that state tested, not sitting peacefully on a page, not discussed in abstract terms. He wants to see what kind of people such a city would produce when faced with war. And Critias says he has exactly the story. Ancient Athens, he claims, once faced the greatest empire on earth, Atlantis. This is the first warning sign that the tale is doing philosophical work. The story arrives at exactly the moment Socrates needs an example of ideal citizens proving themselves in action. It is almost too perfect. Athens is given an enemy of overwhelming size and wealth. The Atlanteans have ships, armies, territory, resources, and imperial ambition. Ancient Athens has virtue, and virtue wins. That is not the structure of a neutral historical report. That is the structure of a moral test. Think back to Plato's Republic, probably his most famous work. In that dialogue, Plato tries to imagine the just city, a society organized around discipline, education, duty, and the idea that each person should perform the role for which they are best suited. Its guardians are not supposed to chase wealth. Its rulers are not supposed to govern for personal pleasure. The whole system is designed to prevent the city from being corrupted by greed, luxury, faction, and ambition. Now look at the Athens in the Atlantis story. It is not exactly the same city as the Republic. Plato does not simply copy and paste one into the other. But the resemblance is obvious. Ancient Athens is orderly. Its warriors live simply. They hold property in common. They are trained for the common good. They defend Greece and Egypt without trying to enslave anyone themselves. They are, in other words, republic-style citizens placed into a legendary past. Atlantis is their opposite. Atlantis begins with order, but abundance changes it. Wealth piles up. Power expands. The rulers lose their restraint. They begin to value domination more than justice. The empire turns outward, trying to bring other peoples under its control. It is the anti-republic, a civilization with incredible technical ability, immense natural resources and military power, but without moral self-control. A state that has everything except the one thing Plato believes matters most: a properly ordered soul. That is why Atlantis is so powerful as literature. It is not just a drowned island, it is a political nightmare. Plato is asking a question that still feels uncomfortably modern. What happens when a society becomes rich enough to do almost anything it wants? Does prosperity make it wiser, or does it simply give its worst impulses larger armies, bigger ships, and more territory to conquer? For Plato, the answer is clear. Power without virtue destroys itself. But if Atlantis was a philosophical invention, why present it as an Egyptian tradition? Why not simply say, here is a myth I made up to explain political corruption? Because ancient authority mattered, and Egypt had more authority than almost anywhere else in the Greek imagination. To Greeks of Plato's time, Egypt was ancient beyond comprehension. Its temples, monuments, priesthoods, and written records seemed to reach back into a past Greece could barely imagine. Greek cities rose and fell. Egypt appeared permanent. So, if you wanted to tell a story that began 9,000 years earlier, Egypt was the perfect place to anchor it. Not because Plato had to be trying to deceive his readers. Ancient writers did not always draw the hard modern line between history, myth, moral teaching, and inherited tradition. A story could be meaningful without being verified in the way we now expect historical claims to be verified. And Plato regularly used stories this way. He used myths to explore things that rational argument could not easily prove. In the Republic, he ends with the myth of a tale about souls, death, judgment, and rebirth. In the Phaedrus, he tells myths of the soul as a charioteer. In the Symposium, he has Aristophanes describe humans as once being round creatures split in half by the gods. Nobody thinks Plato was offering biology. The point was philosophical. But Atlantis is different from those myths in one important way. It is presented with names, genealogies, locations, measurements, political institutions, and a chain of transmission. The priests told Solon. Solon told Dropides. Dropides told Critias. Critias tells Socrates. That detail gives the story weight. It makes Atlantis feel documented, like a lost archive is standing just behind the dialogue, inaccessible to us but supposedly known to Plato's characters. Modern scholars often call this a true story frame. Plato tells us, through Critias, that the tale is not invented. But that claim is itself part of the literary strategy. It encourages the listener to take the moral contrast seriously. Ancient Athens was not merely an ideal state in theory, Plato seems to say. It once existed, and it once proved its worth against the greatest imperial power imaginable. There is also a practical problem with taking the account literally. The Athens that defeats Atlantis around 9600 BCE is far more philosophically organised than any society known from that period. Archaeology does not reveal a city-state in Attica with communal warrior guardians, complex political institutions, and the capacity to lead a Mediterranean coalition against a vast empire. That does not mean people in Greece had no ancestors then. Of course they did. Small hunter-gatherer communities lived in the region. But Plato's prehistoric Athens looks less like a Stone Age settlement, and more like his own political ideals projected backward into deep time. It is Athens purified, Athens without the mistakes Athens had made. And that may be the deepest clue of all. Plato lived after the Peloponnesian War, after Athens had built an empire, imposed tribute on allies, launched disastrous wars, and watched its confidence collapse into defeat. He knew that his own city had not always behaved like the noble defender in the Atlantis story. So perhaps ancient Athens is not historical Athens. Perhaps it is what Plato wished Athens had been. Still, calling Atlantis a Platonic invention does not mean throwing away every possible connection to the real past. Fiction rarely comes from a vacuum. Plato could have drawn on Egyptian flood traditions, Greek memories of earthquakes, stories of rich western lands, reports of strange coastlines, and the very real example of imperial powers rising and falling. A myth can be invented as a story while still carrying fragments of older memories. The question is not whether some flood happened somewhere. Floods happened constantly in human history. The question is whether those scattered memories can be connected to Plato's vast, carefully designed narrative. And to answer that, we have to return to Egypt. Because long before Plato wrote about Atlantis, Egyptian priests were already telling stories about a world repeatedly destroyed by water, fire, and the turning cycles of nature. This is the part of the story where the Egyptian priest says something even stranger than Atlantis. He tells Solon that humanity has not suffered one great destruction. It has suffered many, again and again, he says. Civilizations are wiped out by fire and flood. The survivors are usually the uneducated, the people living in mountains or scattered rural places, while the people of cities, the people with records, laws, temples, and accumulated knowledge, are destroyed. Then the cycle begins again. New societies grow. They learn to farm, build, write, organize themselves. They become convinced that their history stretches back as far as memory can reach. But it does not, because the earlier memory was erased. In Plato's Timaeus, the priest uses the story of Phaethon to explain what he means. In Greek myth, Phaethon tries to drive the chariot of the sun, loses control, and burns the earth. The Egyptians, according to Plato's priest, understood this not as a literal story about a reckless boy in a solar chariot, but as a symbolic memory of catastrophe from the sky, a destruction by fire. And then there are destructions by water. The priest tells Solon that Greece has repeatedly been devastated by floods, while Egypt was protected by its geography. The Nile did not merely threaten Egypt, it sustained it. Floodwaters came every year, depositing fertile black silt across the fields. Egypt's entire civilization depended on that cycle. To a Greek visitor, this could make Egypt seem almost immortal. Greek cities could be burned in war, mountain valleys could be cut off, coastlines could be struck by storms, earthquakes, and tsunamis. But Egypt had the Nile, the desert, and an agricultural rhythm that had continued for generations beyond counting. That does not mean Egypt never faced disaster. It did. Nile failures could cause famine. Low floods meant poor harvests. Excessive floods could damage settlements. Political order could collapse. Foreign armies could invade. But Egyptian religion was built around the idea that destruction was never the whole story. Order had to be renewed. The Egyptians called that order Mat. It meant truth, justice, balance, proper conduct, the stable pattern that held the world together. Against Mat stood Isfet, disorder, violence, falsehood, chaos, the forces that could pull creation apart. Every morning the sun rose again. Every year the Nile returned. Every king was supposed to defend Mart against the chaos pressing in from the edges of the world. This is important because it tells us that Egyptian ideas about catastrophe were not necessarily historical records in the modern sense. They were also religious ideas. The world emerged from primordial waters. Before creation there was none, the limitless watery chaos. Creation itself was not a one-time event safely locked in the past. It had to be maintained every day. The sun god crossed the dangerous darkness each night. Enemies of cosmic order had to be defeated again and again. The Nile's flood withdrew, then returned. Death led to rebirth. Disorder was always waiting. So when an Egyptian priest speaks of humanity being destroyed and renewed in cycles, he may be expressing something deeply Egyptian, not a secret geological report, a worldview, and yet that worldview could still contain memories of real disasters. This is where it gets complicated. Greek myth had its own catastrophic reset story. The best known was the flood of Deucalion. Zeus, angered by human corruption, sends a flood to destroy humanity. Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, survive in a vessel. When the waters recede, they repopulate the world by throwing stones behind them. Stones that become men and women. It is not the same story as Atlantis, but it follows a familiar pattern. Human failure, divine destruction, a few survivors, and a new beginning. Stories like this appear in Mesopotamia, the Levant, India, the Americas, and countless other places. That does not prove every culture remembered the same planet-wide flood. In fact, it probably tells us something more ordinary and more human. Floods are terrifying. They destroy homes, fields, animals, roads, graves, and food supplies. They can kill entire communities in a night. A river that feeds a population for centuries can suddenly become an unstoppable wall of water. A storm surge can erase a coastline. A tsunami can leave survivors wondering whether the sea itself has declared war on the land. If you want to explore more mysteries where ancient stories might preserve traces of real events, you can get our book on the 12 unexplained mysteries through the website. The link is in the description. Now, could Egypt's traditions preserve a specific memory of an Ice Age catastrophe around 9600 BCE? The honest answer is, we cannot show that they do. That date falls near the beginning of the Holocene, when the last Ice Age was ending, climates were changing rapidly, and global sea levels were rising. In some regions, coastlines flooded over generations. Lakes expanded and vanished. Rivers changed course. The world was not ending everywhere at once, but for communities living in vulnerable places, it may have felt like the end of the world. But Egyptian texts do not give us a clear inscription saying, "Our ancestors witnessed the great floods of 9600 BCE. Nothing like that survives. The oldest substantial Egyptian written sources we possess come thousands of years later. The pyramid texts begin appearing around the late 3rd millennium BCE. Other religious writings, temple inscriptions, king lists, myths, and ritual texts survive from later periods, often copied and recopied across centuries. That is extraordinary continuity. But it is not a continuous archive reaching cleanly back to the Ice Age. Papyrus decays, wood decays, leather decays, mud brick buildings collapse. Temples are rebuilt, dynasties fall, priests edit traditions. Kings commission new versions of old stories. What survives is only a fraction of what once existed, and even that fraction is filtered through religious and political purposes. So the Egyptian priest in Plato may reflect real Egyptian beliefs about cycles of destruction. He may also reflect Greek interpretations of Egyptian antiquity, and Plato may be shaping both into a story that serves his own argument. The evidence does not let us choose one explanation with certainty. But it does let us see why the claim was so powerful. Egypt offered Plato something Greece could not easily provide: the image of an ancient civilization that had watched other worlds rise and disappear. A civilization that claimed to remember what everyone else had forgotten. And once that idea enters the Atlantis story, the drowned island stops being just a punishment for imperial arrogance. It becomes part of a much larger fear, the fear that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can vanish, that the people living after a disaster may have no idea what came before them. But did Egypt itself really possess memories stretching back 9,000 years? To answer that, we need to look more closely at what Egyptians believed about their own deep past. If we want to know whether Egypt remembered a civilization from 9,000 years before Solon, the first question is simple. How far back can we actually trace Egypt itself? Not Egypt as a kingdom of pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, and temples. Egypt as a human society growing along the Nile. And the answer is very far back, but not in the way the most extreme claims suggest. Long before the first pharaoh wore the double crown, people lived beside the Nile, hunted, fished, gathered wild plants, raised animals, buried their dead, and gradually built more settled communities. The Nile Valley was not empty before the dynasties. It was a corridor of life between deserts that could be brutally dry. But prehistoric Egypt was not a single hidden super-civilization waiting to be discovered. It was a long, uneven process, small communities becoming larger ones. Farmers becoming craft specialists, local leaders becoming regional rulers, symbols becoming writing, and eventually kingdoms becoming a state. Around 4400 BCE, archaeologists begin identifying what is called the Badarian culture in Upper Egypt, the southern Nile Valley. The Badarians were farmers and herders. They grew crops, raised animals, made distinctive pottery, and buried their dead in cemeteries near their settlements. Some graves contained far more goods than others: fine vessels, ornaments, tools, cosmetic palettes. That matters, because grave differences can reveal differences in status. Some people were beginning to possess more wealth, more prestige, or more power than their neighbours. This was still thousands of years before the pyramids. No giant stone monuments, no pharaohs whose names we can read, no unified Egypt, but it was not primitive in the lazy sense of the word. These were organised communities making choices about farming, trade, burial, identity, and social rank. Then came the Nakada cultures, and this is where the story starts accelerating. Beginning around 4000 BCE, the Nakada period saw societies in Upper Egypt become increasingly connected, increasingly unequal, and increasingly ambitious. Archaeologists divide it into phases, Nakada, I, or and 3, but the larger pattern is clear. Villages grew, trade routes expanded, elites accumulated wealth, and certain centres began to dominate the landscape. Goods arrived from surprisingly far away. Nubian materials from the south, cedar and other products from the Levant, obsidian from distant volcanic regions, gold, stone, ivory shells, and luxury goods moving through networks that connected the Nile Valley to northeastern Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. Think about what that requires. You need people who know where materials come from. People who can organize journeys, people who can protect valuable goods, people who can store them, redistribute them, and turn them into political power. This is not yet an empire, but it is the machinery from which states are made. At places like Abydos, archaeologists have found elite tombs growing larger and richer over time. At Heracles, there is evidence of large ceremonial spaces, specialized craft production, brewing, feasting, and powerful local institutions. Decorative objects show boats, animals, captives, rulers, and scenes that look increasingly political. Not just daily life. Power. By the end of the Nakada period, around 3300 to 3100 BCE, Egypt was moving towards something revolutionary: administration on a national scale. Small inscribed labels found in royal tombs at Abydos are among the earliest evidence for Egyptian writing. They recorded goods, places, names, and perhaps taxes or deliveries. Writing did not appear because somebody wanted to compose poetry. It appeared because power creates paperwork. If you control grain, cattle, labourers, workshops, land and trade, you need a way to count. You need a way to remember. You need a way to make authority visible beyond the limits of one person's memory. Then, around 3100 BCE, the first dynasties emerge. Traditionally, this is the age associated with Narmer, sometimes linked with the later legendary figure Menes. The famous Narmer palette shows a ruler wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, striking an enemy and presenting himself as master of a united land. Whether unification happened in one dramatic conquest or through a longer process of alliances, warfare and absorption is still debated. But the result is not. By the early dynastic period, Egypt was becoming one of the world's first territorial states. A king ruled from the Nile Delta to the southern valley. Administrators tracked resources. Royal cemeteries were built at Abydos. Monumental mud brick tombs appeared. Royal symbols became standardized. The state could mobilize labor, extract goods, and project an image of order across hundreds of miles. The pyramids did not create Egyptian civilization. They were built on top of centuries of earlier development, and that is important for the Atlantis question, because Egypt really was ancient. Even the Old Kingdom pyramid builders were inheriting traditions already old by their standards. By Plato's time, Egyptian kingship, temple ritual, sacred symbols, and funerary practices seemed to stretch backward into a nearly unimaginable past. But nearly unimaginable is not the same as unlimited. Egyptians themselves had king lists, and these lists complicate everything. Some lists are remarkably practical. They name rulers in sequence, preserve regnal years, and connect kings to dynasties. The Palermo Stone, the Abydos King List, and the Turin Royal Canon are priceless sources for reconstructing Egyptian chronology. But they are not modern history books. They were political documents, religious documents, statements about legitimate rule. A king list could omit rulers considered illegitimate. It could favour one royal line over another. It could present history as a smooth chain of rightful succession, even when real succession was messy, violent, and uncertain. And beyond the human kings lay something even more ancient. Egyptian tradition could place gods at the beginning of rule. Divine beings, semi-divine ancestors, and the followers of Horus appeared in later accounts of Egypt's remote past. The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, described vast ages in which gods and spirits ruled before mortal dynasties. To modern readers, these enormous reigns can sound like a secret chronology, a lost history measured in tens of thousands of years. But for Egyptians, the earliest past was not always historical time as we understand it. It was sacred time, the time when gods established kingship, created order, and defeated chaos for the first time. It was the age before the world became fully ordinary. That distinction changes the entire discussion. Cultural continuity is real. Egyptians preserved rituals, symbols, sacred places, and royal ideals for millennia. Sacred time is real too. Their religious imagination reached back to creation itself. But verifiable chronology is something narrower. It depends on inscriptions, archaeological layers, radiocarbon dates, settlements, graves, tools, food remains, and objects that can be placed in sequence. By that standard, Egypt's path towards civilization is astonishingly ancient, but it does not reach back to 9600 BCE as a pharaonic kingdom with writing, cities, archives, and dynasties. Around that date, the Nile Valley and surrounding regions were inhabited by human communities adapting to a changing post-Ice Age world. There may be sites still buried beneath modern fields, deep Nile sediments, or the waters of the Mediterranean. Archaeology never has the final word, but there is currently no evidence for an Egyptian state, an Egyptian priesthood, or an Egyptian archive 9,000 years before Solon. So Egypt's deep past is neither a fraud nor a forgotten technological empire. It is something more interesting, a civilization that really did rise from an extraordinarily long prehistoric process, then transformed that process into a sacred history of gods, kings, destruction, and renewal. And that raises the next problem. Even if Egypt did not possess a written archive from 9600 BCE, could any archive anywhere survive long enough for a priest at Sais to claim knowledge of such a distant past? Could any archive anywhere survive long enough for a priest at Sais to claim knowledge of such a distant past? At first, the answer seems obvious. Egypt had writing. Egypt had temples. Egypt had scribes, whose entire profession was based on preserving information. They recorded harvests, taxes, land boundaries, royal decrees, ritual instructions, medical recipes, astronomical observations, military campaigns, and the names of kings going back centuries. If any ancient civilization could keep a memory alive for thousands of years, surely it would be Egypt. But surviving information is not the same thing as surviving paper. And paper, or at least Egypt's version of it, had limits. Papyrus was made from the pith of a Nile plant, pressed into sheets and written on with ink. In the dry Egyptian desert, papyrus can survive for an astonishingly long time. Some documents are more than 4,000 years old. Letters, accounts, legal contracts, stories, temple records, even school exercises have endured because sand, dryness, and sealed tombs protected them. But papyrus is not immortal. Put it in damp soil, expose it to insects, flood it, burn it, handle it too often, or leave it in an active building for generations, and it deteriorates. The reason so much papyrus survives in Egypt is not because archives were indestructible. It is because huge quantities were thrown away, buried, sealed, or abandoned in unusually dry places. An archive stored in a functioning temple was actually vulnerable. Priests used it, scribes handled it, new records were added. Old records were moved, political regimes changed. Temple complexes were expanded, damaged, looted, rebuilt, and sometimes abandoned entirely. A scroll might last centuries under ideal conditions. It would not simply sit untouched for 9,000 years waiting for Solon to arrive. So if the priests at Sais possessed very ancient information, the most plausible mechanism would not be one miraculous surviving scroll from 9600 BCE. It would be copying, again and again. A document is copied when it becomes old. Then the copy is copied. A damaged version is repaired. A sacred text is transferred to a new role. A temple list is updated under a new king. An inscription is recopied onto a wall, a stela, or a new papyrus. This is how many ancient traditions survived at all. But copying creates a new problem. Every generation of scribes has power over the past. They can preserve a text faithfully. They can also shorten it, clarify it, rearrange it, translate it, harmonize contradictions, remove embarrassing names, and add material that serves the present. This was not necessarily fraud. Ancient people did not always think of historical writing the way modern historians do. A record could be valued because it preserved religious truth, royal legitimacy, or the proper cosmic order, not because every detail had been transmitted exactly as it happened. Egyptian king lists show this clearly. They can preserve real sequences of rulers over extraordinary lengths of time. But they can also omit rulers who were politically inconvenient. The Abydos king list, created under Seti Tenth I, leaves out several kings now known from archaeology, including female ruler Hatshepsut and the Amarna pharaohs associated with Akhenaten's religious revolution. Imagine what that means. A royal monument could be precise where precision served its purpose, and selective where selection served its purpose. Egyptian archives were not neutral warehouses of facts. They were living instruments of temple and state power, and they faced disasters. The Nile, source of Egypt's wealth, could also threaten settlements and storage areas. Flooding, moisture, fire, civil war, tomb robbing, foreign invasion, administrative collapse, and simple reuse destroyed enormous amounts of material. Stone blocks from old temples were often taken apart and built into new monuments. Statues were reinscribed with the names of later kings. Older texts disappeared not because anyone hated them, but because stone was valuable and rebuilding was normal. Even the great libraries of the ancient world were fragile. A single fire could erase a collection. A change in language could make texts unreadable. A temple's closure could end the chain of copying that kept its traditions alive. And once a document was no longer copied, it was usually only a matter of time before insects, damp, decay, or human activity finished the job. Now compare all of this with the date Plato gives us. Solon lived around 600 BCE. 9,000 years before Solon takes us back to roughly 9,600 BCE. The earliest decipherable Egyptian writing appears around 3,300 BCE, perhaps a little earlier depending on how we interpret the evidence. That is still roughly 6,000 years after the supposed war between Athens and Atlantis. 6,000 years. That is not a small missing gap. It is the distance from the first Egyptian labels at Abydos to our own era. For the priests of Sais to have possessed an exact written historical record of events around 9,600 BCE, that record would have needed to survive through thousands of years before Egypt had writing at all. It would then need to be written down accurately once writing appeared, copied through the rise and fall of dynasties, preserved through political upheavals and foreign conquests, and somehow remain recognizable to priests living in the first millennium BCE. Possible in the absolute sense, almost nothing is impossible. Plausible on the evidence we have? Not very. But written archives are not the only way humans remember. Oral traditions can last a very long time. Stories can preserve memories of floods, migrations, volcanoes, changing coastlines, lost hunting grounds, and encounters with strangers. Indigenous communities in different parts of the world may preserve traditions with roots far older than their written records. But oral traditions do not function like a calendar locked in a vault. They change as they are told. Names shift, places move. Heroes become gods, separate disasters merge into one enormous catastrophe. A memory of a real coastal flood can become a story about the whole world drowning. A defeated enemy can become a vast empire, and numbers, especially sacred numbers, can expand until they signal not a measurable date, but unimaginable antiquity. That may be the key. The Egyptian priests might have preserved a genuine tradition of repeated destruction. Floods, fire, drought, invasions, the collapse of old orders, whole communities vanishing from the map. They may have linked that tradition to a story of an ancient conflict. Greek visitors may have heard it, translated it, reshaped it, or misunderstood parts of it. And Plato may have used it because 9,000 years sounded exactly like what it was meant to sound like. Not recent, not ordinary, not safely within Greek history. Deep time, a past so remote that Athens itself could be imagined as older, nobler, and purer than the city Plato knew. So the evidence does not support a continuous, exact Egyptian archive reaching back to 9,600 BCE. Papyrus could not do it alone. Stone inscriptions could preserve selected memories, but not a complete, untouched historical record across 9 millennia. Copying could extend traditions, but copying also transforms them. What Egypt could preserve was something more complicated. Fragments, sacred narratives, king lists, temple traditions, memories repeatedly rewritten to make sense of the present. and sometimes those fragments can carry a real event across extraordinary distances in time. The question is whether Atlantis was one of those events, or whether it was what happened when ancient memories, Egyptian prestige, Greek storytelling, and Plato's philosophy were fused into one unforgettable story. If Atlantis was not a literal record from 9600 BCE, then maybe it was a distorted memory of something much later. Something real. Something violent enough that people told stories about it for centuries. This is where Santorini enters the picture. Santorini is a volcanic island in the southern Aegean Sea, north of Crete. Today it looks almost too dramatic to be real. White villages sit along the rim of a vast flooded crater. Dark cliffs rise out of deep water. The islands form a rough circle around a blue submerged centre. That centre is a caldera, a volcanic crater created when an enormous eruption emptied part of the magma chamber beneath the island. The ground above collapsed, the sea rushed in. What remains is the broken rim of a volcano that tore itself apart. And during the Bronze Age, before the eruption, Santorini was home to a sophisticated settlement called Akrotiri. Akrotiri had multi-story buildings, paved streets, drainage systems, storage rooms, workshops, and extraordinary wall paintings. Its people traded across the Aegean and beyond. They had access to goods from Crete, mainland Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East. This was not a primitive fishing village sitting at the edge of the world. It was part of a connected maritime civilization. Most archaeologists associate Akrotiri with the Minoan world centered on Crete. The Minoans were one of Europe's earliest complex societies. They built large palace centers at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They used writing. They produced elaborate art. They ran trade networks across the sea. Their ships connected islands, coastlines, ports, and distant kingdoms. To later Greeks, this kind of Bronze Age world must have seemed almost legendary. A powerful island civilization, rich in ships, skilled in trade, surrounded by the sea, suddenly destroyed by fire, earthquakes, ash, and water. You can see why people started looking at Santorini and thinking, Atlantis. The eruption of Thera, the ancient name for Santorini, was one of the largest volcanic events of the last several thousand years. Exactly when it happened is still debated. Radiocarbon evidence and tree ring dating tend to point toward the late 17th century BCE, perhaps around 1620 to 1600 BCE. Some archaeological chronologies have placed it somewhat later. The precise date matters to specialists, but the basic reality does not. A huge eruption occurred. First came earthquakes, probably warning the people of Akrotiri that something was wrong. Then ash began falling. Explosions blasted volcanic material into the atmosphere. Entire landscapes were buried. The eruption column may have risen high into the sky. Pumice fell across the region, and as the volcano collapsed, the sea may have generated tsunamis that struck nearby coasts. Akrotiri itself was preserved beneath volcanic deposits, almost like a Bronze Age Pompeii. But unlike Pompeii, archaeologists have found very few human bodies there. That suggests many residents may have escaped after the early earthquakes before the final catastrophe. They had time to flee, but flee to where? Their homes, crops, ships, workshops, and harbour infrastructure may have been devastated. Even if thousands survived, their island world had changed forever. Now add Crete. Crete lies roughly 110 kilometres south of Santorini, close enough that the eruption would have been impossible to ignore. Tsunami deposits have been identified at some sites around the Aegean, and coastal settlements may have suffered destructive waves. Ash from Thera reached Crete and travelled far beyond it. The eruption disrupted trade routes, damaged ports, and injected chaos into a maritime economy built on dependable connections. For a society whose wealth moved by ship, the sea itself had become an enemy. This is one of the strongest arguments for a Santorini connection. Plato describes Atlantis as a naval power. The Minoans were probably the greatest seafaring civilization in the Aegean before the rise of Mycenaean Greece. Plato describes sudden destruction by earthquakes and floods. Thera gave the ancient Mediterranean exactly that kind of nightmare. Earth shaking, fire erupting, waves crossing the sea, an island physically transformed. And then, after the eruption, Minoan Crete declined. Not immediately, and not from one simple cause. This is important. The old version of the story said Thera exploded. The tsunami destroyed Crete, and Minoan civilization vanished overnight. Archaeology does not support anything that neat. Minoan centers continued after the eruption. Knossos remained important. The final collapse of Minoan palace power came later, especially around 1450 BCE, when many major sites on Crete were destroyed. Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland then became dominant on the island. So Thera did not single-handedly erase the Minoans, but it may have weakened them. Think about what a disaster like that does to a trading system. Even if palaces remain standing, losses accumulate. Ships are destroyed. Harbours are damaged. Harvests fail. Trade partners become unreliable. Political rivals see weakness. Local elites lose legitimacy. And then years or generations later, another crisis arrives. Civilizations rarely collapse because of one blow. More often, a major disaster creates cracks. Wars, invasions, economic stress, and internal conflict widen them. Eventually, the structure that once looked permanent comes down. That sounds remarkably close to an Atlantis story. But then come the problems. Plato says Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon, placing it around 9,600 BCE. Thera erupted roughly 1,600 years before Plato, not 9,000. That is a mismatch of more than 7 millennia. Plato also places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. Santorini is nowhere near there. It is deep inside the Greek world in the Aegean Sea. And Plato's Atlantis is not just an island destroyed by a volcano. It is a vast imperial power that attacks Athens, rules territory beyond its own shores, and threatens much of the Mediterranean. Bronze Age Crete was powerful, wealthy, and maritime. But there is no evidence that the Minoans launched the kind of continent-spanning invasion Plato describes. Nor is there evidence for Plato's ancient Athens defeating them in some forgotten war. Because in the period of the Theran eruption, there was no Athens remotely like Plato's idealized city. So Santorini is not a complete solution. It does not fit the date. It does not fit the location. It does not fit the war. It does not fit the scale of Plato's empire. But it may fit something else. It may fit the emotional core of the story, a brilliant island culture, a civilization tied to the sea, a sudden eruption, earthquakes, flood waves, a landscape swallowed and remade, survivors carrying memories to other islands and coasts. Generations later, the facts becoming stories, the stories becoming warnings, and eventually a philosopher taking those warnings and building Atlantis out of them. Not as a historical transcript, as a memory of catastrophe, enlarged until it became a civilization-sized myth. But Santorini was not the last great disaster of the Bronze Age. Several centuries later, the entire eastern Mediterranean began coming apart. Around 1200 BCE, kingdoms that had survived for generations suddenly faced a crisis so widespread that historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Palaces burned, trade routes failed, cities were abandoned. Populations moved, empires that had seemed permanent discovered that permanent was not the same thing as invincible. This was the world of Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, Canaanite city-states, Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt under the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. These societies were deeply connected. Bronze came from copper and tin brought across huge distances. Luxury goods moved between royal courts. Grain shipments crossed the sea. Diplomats wrote letters to one another. Kings married foreign princesses. A famine in one region, a war in another, a pirate attack on a trade route could create problems far beyond the original crisis. Think of it like a machine with dozens of interlocking gears. As long as every gear keeps turning, the system works. But when enough gears jam at once, the whole machine starts tearing itself apart. That may be what happened after 1200 BCE. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, disappeared. Its capital at Hattusa was abandoned and burned. Major cities in the Levant suffered destruction. Cyprus faced attacks and upheaval. Trade networks that had linked the Mediterranean for centuries shrank dramatically. And Egypt, the ancient kingdom that Plato's priests were supposed to represent, was caught in the middle of it. Egypt did not collapse in the same way as the Hittites or the Mycenaean palace states. It survived, but survival was not easy. Egyptian inscriptions describe battles against groups later called the Sea Peoples. This is one of the most mysterious phrases in ancient history. It sounds almost cinematic. Sea Peoples, a coalition of maritime invaders appearing from beyond the horizon, attacking coastlines, burning cities, threatening Egypt itself. The truth is more complicated. The Egyptians did not use one neat label equivalent to Sea Peoples. That is a modern term historians use for several groups named in Egyptian texts. These included peoples called the Sherdan, Shekelish, Peliset, Denyen, Tieka, Weshesh and others. Some may have come from the Aegean, some from Anatolia, some from the central Mediterranean, some may have been displaced communities rather than organised armies from a single homeland. We do not know exactly who all of them were, but Egyptian records make one thing very clear. Large groups were moving. Under Pharaoh Meneptah, around 1208 BCE, Egypt fought a coalition that included foreign groups arriving in Libya. A generation later, under Ramses III, the threat became even more severe. Inscriptions at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu describe enemies advancing by land and sea. They came, the text says, with ships and with families. Carts carried women and children. This was not just a raid for treasure. It looks more like migration under pressure. People were on the move because something had gone wrong in the world they knew. The famous reliefs at Medinet Habu show ships clashing in battle. Egyptian archers fire from the shore. Enemy vessels are crowded with warriors. The Egyptians claim victory, as royal inscriptions always do. Ramses says he trapped the invaders and destroyed them. But even if we allow for pharaonic exaggeration, the danger was real. Egypt had been attacked at its frontiers during a period when other great kingdoms were already falling. The Egyptian state held together, but its wealth, authority, and reach weakened. In the centuries that followed, the new kingdom would decline. Now compare that to Atlantis. Plato describes a powerful maritime empire. An island people with ships, armies, wealth, and imperial ambition. They move against other lands, they threaten Egypt, Greece, and the wider world. Then catastrophe destroys them. You can see the resemblance. Not because the Sea Peoples were Atlantis. There is no evidence for that. Plato never names them. Egyptian inscriptions do not describe a sunken island empire beyond Gibraltar. The dates do not match. The geography does not match. And the Sea Peoples were probably not one united civilization at all. They may have been exactly the opposite, not a single empire expanding outward, but fragments of many societies collapsing inward. Refugees, raiders, mercenaries, displaced farmers, sailors without ports, soldiers without kings. People from a shattered Bronze Age world moving across the sea because staying where they were had become impossible. But stories do not always preserve causes accurately. They preserve terror. Imagine surviving in a coastal city when ships appear offshore. You do not know whether the people aboard are traders, refugees, pirates, or an army. Then the city burns. The palace falls. The granaries are empty. The king is dead or gone. Your children grow up hearing that the sea brought destruction. A century later, the story is no longer about one battle. It is about the time when nations came from the water. 3 centuries later, it becomes a tale of a great sea power that tried to conquer the world. 1,000 years later, perhaps it becomes Atlantis. This is the appeal of linking the Sea Peoples to Plato's story. Egypt really did preserve written records of maritime conflict. Egypt really did encounter migrations and invasions during a civilization-wide disaster. And Greek memory really did reach backward into a Bronze Age world that had become half history, half legend. The Trojan War itself may contain echoes of that same age. Later Greeks remembered kings, ships, fortified cities, heroic battles, and the destruction of powerful places. But they remembered them through poems composed centuries after the palaces had fallen. Memory survived. Accuracy did not always survive with it. That is the limit we have to keep in mind. Egyptian inscriptions from Ramses III are real documents, carved close to the events they describe. Plato wrote more than 700 years later. Between them stood generations of political change, lost archives, oral storytelling, Greek myth-making, and Plato's own philosophical purpose. You cannot draw a straight line from Medinet Habu to Atlantis, but you can imagine a long, winding one. Real disasters leave scars in human memory. They become stories because stories are portable. A ruined city becomes a warning. A migration becomes an invasion. A coalition becomes an empire. A drowned harbour becomes a continent swallowed by the sea. And once enough centuries pass, history does not disappear. It changes shape. The Bronze Age collapse may not explain Atlantis, but it shows exactly how a connected world can fail, how survivors can carry fragments of catastrophe across the sea, and how those fragments can grow into legends far larger than the events that first created them. But there is another kind of disaster that may be even more important than war. Not a city burning in a single night. Not ships appearing over the horizon. A disaster that unfolded so slowly that one generation might barely notice it, while over centuries and millennia, it erased entire landscapes from the map. The end of the last ice age changed the shape of the world. At its coldest point around 20,000 years ago, enormous volumes of Earth's water were locked up in continental ice sheets. Glaciers covered much of northern Europe and North America. Sea level was not a few meters lower than it is today. It was more than 120 meters lower. That means coastlines were in completely different places. The English Channel was not a channel. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a vast lowland plain. The Persian Gulf was largely a river valley. Much of Southeast Asia formed a single enormous landmass called Sunderland, linking modern Malaysia, Sumatra, Java and Borneo. Coastlines around the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, India, Australia, and the Americas extended far beyond their modern edges, and humans lived on those vanished lands. They hunted there. They gathered shellfish there, They built camps beside rivers that no longer exist. Later, some of them farmed there, buried their dead there, raised children there, and watched the shoreline creep closer. Then the ice began to melt, not all at once, not as one single global flood, but in pulses over thousands of years. The oceans rose. Meltwater poured into the sea from collapsing ice sheets. In some periods, the rise may have been fast enough to transform coastlines within the span of a few human lifetimes. A beach becomes a marsh becomes a tidal flat becomes open water, and the village that once stood beside the river is gone. This is one of the strangest facts about prehistory. Some of the places where human beings were most likely to live are now underwater. Coasts are rich environments: fish, shellfish, birds, fresh water, fertile soils, easy travel by boat. Rivers draw people, estuaries draw people, sheltered bays draw people. But because sea level was lower during the Ice Age, many ancient coastlines are now drowned beneath tens of meters of water. Archaeologists have found pieces of this lost world. In the North Sea, fishermen have dragged up animal bones, stone tools and fragments of ancient landscapes from the area once called Doggerland. This was not a mysterious continent filled with crystal pyramids or lost supercities. It was a real low-lying region between Britain and Europe, crossed by rivers and inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. For thousands of years, Doggerland shrank. The sea pushed inward. Wetlands replaced dry ground. Islands formed where plains had been. Then, around 6200 BCE, a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway triggered the Storegga tsunami. Waves swept across parts of the already vulnerable North Sea coast. For people living there, it could have felt like the end of the world. Not the end of the planet, the end of their world. The same story happened elsewhere. Around the Persian Gulf, ancient river systems once crossed land that is now beneath shallow water. In Southeast Asia, rising seas broke apart the Great Plains of Sunderland, creating the islands we know today. Along the coasts of India, China, Australia and the Americas, former hunting grounds and settlements disappeared beneath the advancing ocean. Even in the Mediterranean, where Plato placed the Egyptian story in the background, coastlines changed dramatically after the Ice Age. River mouths shifted. Coastal plains flooded, islands became islands only after the sea cut them off from the mainland. And there are actual submerged settlements. Atlit Yam, off the coast of modern Israel, lies beneath the Mediterranean. It was a Neolithic village occupied around 7000 BCE, with stone structures, wells, animal remains, and human burials preserved underwater. The site was not Atlantis. It was a small farming and fishing community. But it proves the larger point. People were living on coasts that no longer exist. Their homes are underwater because the sea rose. That matters because it gives us a realistic mechanism for the birth of flood memory. Imagine a community whose grandparents remember fields farther out toward the sea. Their parents remember a village that had to move uphill. They remember old stone walls visible beneath shallow water at low tide. They tell their children that the sea took the land of their ancestors. Now keep telling that story for 500 years, then 1,000. The old village becomes a drowned town. The drowned town becomes a kingdom. The kingdom becomes a rich and powerful land, swallowed by divine punishment, earthquakes, floods, or the anger of the sea. That is not how history always works, but it is how memory can work. And there is at least some evidence that oral traditions can preserve the outlines of ancient environmental change for surprisingly long periods. Several Aboriginal Australian traditions describe places where the sea covered coastal plains or cut islands away from the mainland. Some researchers have argued that these stories may preserve memories of sea level rise more than 7,000 years ago, That claim is debated. It is difficult to prove that any specific story has survived unchanged for millennia. Oral traditions evolve, they are retold, adapted, merged with later events, and shaped by the needs of the present. But the basic idea is not impossible. Human societies remember landscapes. They remember where rivers used to flow. They remember mountains, caves, springs, dangerous reefs, old boundaries, and ancestral places. In communities without written maps, stories can function as maps. They carry information across generations. So perhaps some flood myths began with real water. Not necessarily one global flood. Not necessarily Noah's flood, or Deucalion's flood, or a single catastrophe that drowned the entire world. Different communities faced different disasters, river floods, tsunamis, storm surges, landslides, melting glaciers, rising seas. A world full of local floods will produce many flood stories. That is why the existence of flood myths across the world is fascinating, but not decisive. It tells us that water has always been one of humanity's greatest threats. It does not prove that every culture was remembering the same event, and it certainly does not prove that all of them were remembering Atlantis. This is where the argument often goes too far. People discover that huge areas of prehistoric land are underwater. Then they make a leap. If the land is underwater, they say, there must have been cities. If there were cities, there must have been civilization. If there was civilization, perhaps it was Atlantis. But every step in that chain needs evidence. Submerged land is real. Submerged settlements are real. Lost coastlines, drowned valleys, and ancient communities displaced by rising water are all real. But none of that automatically gives us a lost advanced civilization with an empire, monumental architecture, a navy crossing oceans, and a war against prehistoric Athens. Most people living on those vanished coasts were hunter-gatherers, fishers, or early farmers. Their lives may have been complex, skilled, and culturally rich. They may have known their landscapes with an intimacy we can barely imagine. But complexity is not the same thing as an empire. Still, there is something powerful here. Plato's Atlantis ends in water. His story is full of land, sea, earthquakes, flooding, and a civilization that vanishes so completely that later people can barely believe it existed. That combination may not be a literal historical record, but it touches a real prehistoric experience. The sea has been taking land from humans since the Ice Age ended. It has taken homes, fields, burial grounds, harbours, and whole coastlines. It has hidden evidence of early human life in the places archaeologists have the hardest time reaching. Beneath modern waves may lie thousands of sites we have never seen, and that leaves us with an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the reason prehistory sometimes looks empty is not because nothing happened. Maybe it is because the evidence is underwater, and the evidence is not only underwater. Some of it was hiding in plain sight, beneath hills, fields, and layers of later settlement. Some of it has only been excavated in the last few decades. And every time archaeologists uncover one of these sites, the old picture of prehistory becomes a little harder to hold on to. For a long time, the standard story seemed simple. First, humans were hunter-gatherers, small mobile bands following animals, gathering plants, living in temporary camps. Then they discovered agriculture. Farming created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed permanent villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns produced temples, monuments, rulers, and eventually civilization. It is a useful outline, but real history is messier, because in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, there is a hill called Göbekli Tepe, and beneath that hill are some of the most astonishing structures ever found from the beginning of the Holocene. The oldest parts of Göbekli Tepe date back to roughly 9600 BCE. The same period, Plato's Egyptian priests supposedly placed the war between Athens and Atlantis. That does not mean Göbekli Tepe was Atlantis. It was not an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It was not a naval empire. There is no evidence of a war with prehistoric Greece, no evidence of a continent-sized kingdom, and no evidence that its builders had the kind of state described by Plato. But it does mean something important around the time later. Traditions placed at the edge of remembered history, human communities were already capable of organizing projects far more ambitious than older models had expected. At Göbekli Tepe, people built massive circular and oval stone enclosures. In their centers stood towering T-shaped limestone pillars, some more than 5 meters high and weighing many tons. Other pillars formed rings around them. Some were carved with foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, insects, and strange abstract symbols. A few of the great central pillars appear almost human. They have arms, hands, belts, and perhaps garments carved into the stone. These were not casual campfire decorations. They required quarrying stone, shaping it, moving it, coordinating labour, feeding workers, planning construction, maintaining a shared symbolic world powerful enough to persuade many people to participate. And the people who built the earliest monuments may not yet have been fully agricultural in the later Neolithic sense. They were living during a transition. They gathered wild cereals. They hunted gazelle, wild cattle, boar, and other animals. They had begun changing the landscape around them. Over time, communities in the region would domesticate wheat, barley, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. But Göbekli Tepe shows that ritual gathering and monumental construction did not have to wait for fully developed farming villages, kings, taxes, writing, or cities. In fact, some archaeologists have proposed almost the reverse of the old model. Maybe people did not build monuments because agriculture had already made them powerful. Maybe the need to gather for ritual, feasting, alliance building, and collective labour helped create the social pressures that made agriculture more attractive. Picture groups scattered across a difficult landscape at the end of the Ice Age, families and small bands living separately most of the year. Then at certain times they come together at a sacred place. They exchange gifts, find marriage partners, share food, settle disputes, tell stories, perform rituals, honour ancestors, animals, spirits, or forces we can no longer understand. And then they build, not a palace for a king, not a city hall, something older and stranger, a place built because many communities believed it mattered. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Nearby sites, including Karahan Tepe and other settlements across southeastern Anatolia, have revealed carved pillars, communal structures, and an entire cultural landscape more complex than anyone expected from people living so early. At Karahan Tepe, excavators have found chambers with stone pillars and carved figures that suggest rituals we still cannot fully interpret. The point is not that archaeologists have discovered a lost super-civilization. They have not. The point is that the line between hunter-gatherer and civilization was never as clean as textbooks once made it seem. Further south, in the Levant, communities were also settling down long before the classic age of cities. Jericho, near the Jordan River, was occupied by the 10th millennium BCE. Its early inhabitants built substantial structures and remarkably a stone tower with a wall around part of the settlement. Archaeologists still debate exactly what that wall and tower were for. Defense is one possibility. Flood control may be another. Ritual meaning may have been involved too. Whatever the answer, it was not the work of people incapable of planning beyond tomorrow. At sites such as Ain Malaha, people had built relatively permanent stone houses even earlier, while still relying heavily on hunting, fishing, and gathering. At Cheuni in Anatolia, Communities experimented with new forms of architecture, animal management, and food production. Over thousands of years, these experiments transformed human life. People became more settled. Settlements grew. Animals and plants became domesticated. Ritual spaces became more elaborate. Networks of exchange carried obsidian, shells, pigments, and ideas over long distances. By the time pottery, larger villages, and fully developed farming communities spread across the Near East, the foundations of a new world had already been laid. This is why sites like Göbekli Tepe are so often pulled into Atlantis theories. They are old, much older than the pyramids, older than Sumerian writing, older than Minoan Crete. They are monumental, mysterious, and clearly the product of people whose beliefs were richer and more organized than the stereotype of primitive cavemen allows. That gap between stereotype and reality creates a perfect opening for speculation. If people could build Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BCE, people ask, what else might they have built? If archaeologists were wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? And that is a fair question. Archaeology is always incomplete. New excavations change old assumptions, underwater landscapes remain poorly explored, organic materials decay, many early sites are buried, destroyed, or still undiscovered. We should be humble about what we think we know, but humility has limits. Göbekli Tepe expands prehistory. It does not erase evidence standards. A ceremonial complex, however impressive, is not automatically a city. A network of villages is not automatically an empire. Skilled stoneworking is not evidence of ocean-crossing fleets. Shared religious symbolism is not proof of a global civilization. And an ancient date that happens to overlap with Plato's 9,000-year number is not confirmation that Plato was reporting literal Bronze Age or Ice Age history. Plato's Atlantis has specific claims: a great island power beyond the pillars of Heracles, a rich and organized imperial state, vast armies and fleets, concentric rings of water and land, a war against ancient Athens, and a sudden destruction in earthquakes and floods. Göbekli Tepe gives us none of that. What it gives us is something arguably more valuable. It gives us real evidence that human beings at the dawn of the Holocene were already imaginative, organized, symbolic, and capable of gathering in large numbers for shared purposes. They were not waiting passively for civilization to arrive. They were creating the conditions from which later civilizations would grow. And that changes how we should hear the Egyptian priests' claim. Maybe 9600 BCE was not an empty darkness beyond the reach of human memory. Maybe it was a world of shrines, villages, rituals, shifting coastlines, experimental farming, and communities whose achievements we are only beginning to see. But a world more complex than we expected is not necessarily the world Plato described. To find Atlantis, we would need more than mystery. We would need evidence, and that is exactly where the hunt for Atlantis becomes dangerous. Because once you accept that prehistory was more complex than we used to think, almost any ancient landscape can start to look like a candidate. A drowned plain becomes a lost kingdom, a circular mountain becomes the rings of Atlantis. An old harbour becomes proof of Plato's great naval empire. And before long, the question stops being, what does the evidence show? It becomes, how can we make this place fit? Over the last 2,000 years, Atlantis has been placed almost everywhere. In the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in North Africa, in the Caribbean, near Antarctica, in the Azores, the Canary Islands, Ireland, Sweden, Spain, even in places Plato could not possibly have known existed. But a location is not evidence simply because it is dramatic, ancient, or underwater. It has to match the whole story, and one of the most serious modern candidates begins on the southwestern coast of Spain. Near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River lies a vast lowland region known as Doñana. Today it is a landscape of marshes, dunes, lagoons and wetlands. It is beautiful, difficult to cross, and constantly changing. Rivers shift, storms reshape the coast, sediment buries old shorelines. Land that was once dry can become swamp. Land that was once sea can slowly turn into plain. For Atlantis hunters, this is almost irresistible. Ancient writers described a wealthy culture in southern Iberia called Tartessos. Greek sources placed it somewhere in this general region, near the far western edge of their known world. Tartessos was associated with trade, metals, river routes, and extraordinary wealth. Then, in later accounts, it seems to disappear, a rich ancient society near a coastal marshland that may have been transformed by floods and sediment. You can see why people make the connection. Some researchers have proposed that buried settlements beneath the Doñana marshes might preserve evidence of a major ancient centre. Satellite images and aerial surveys have revealed shapes in the landscape that some interpret as traces of walls, canals, or circular structures. But this is where interpretation runs ahead of excavation. Marshlands produce patterns. Natural channels curve. Sediment deposits form ridges. Human farming, drainage, roads, and later settlements leave marks of their own. A shape seen from above is not automatically a city. And even if buried ruins were found, they would still have to be dated. That is the problem for the Iberian theory. Tartessos belongs mainly to the first millennium BCE, thousands of years after Plato's supposed date of 9600 BCE. It may preserve memories of real Western wealth, real trade networks, and real disasters along a vulnerable coast. But it is not, at least on present evidence, a straightforward match for a civilization destroyed at the end of the Ice Age. Then there is North Africa. This possibility has an obvious attraction. Egypt itself sits in North Africa. Plato's story comes to us through Egyptian priests, and during wetter phases of the ancient past, much of the Sahara was not the desert we know today. It had lakes, rivers, grasslands, herds of animals, human communities living in regions now too dry to support them. Around the early Holocene, when the climate changed and monsoon rains pushed farther north, the Sahara became dramatically greener. Rock art across the desert shows cattle, wild animals, boats, and people living in landscapes that no longer exist. Could a prosperous society have flourished there before the desert returned? Absolutely. Could one of those societies have been Atlantis? That is much harder to say. Some theories point to the region around Tunisia, arguing that a large inland basin, later flooded by the sea, may lie behind Plato's descriptions of a plain, mountains, and water. Others look toward the Atlas Mountains, whose very name seems impossible to ignore. After all, Plato says Atlantis lay near a mountain called Atlas. But names can deceive. The Greeks used Atlas for a range of lands, mountains, and mythic ideas in the far west. A shared name does not establish a shared location. And the Sahara's lost lakes, ancient settlements, and changing climate do not automatically create an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The geography still matters. Plato says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. That phrase points outward from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic world. But even that is not as simple as it sounds. Ancient geography was not modern cartography. Greek writers did not have satellite maps, accurate longitudes, or a clear understanding of the size of Africa, Europe, and the Atlantic Ocean. They mixed travellers' reports with rumour, myth, philosophy, and inherited geographical traditions. A place beyond the Pillars could mean just outside the strait, somewhere along the Atlantic coast or in a remote Western Ocean only vaguely imagined. And then there are the Atlantic islands. The Azores are often proposed because they sit far out in the Atlantic, roughly where many people expect a lost island civilization to be. The Canary Islands attract similar attention. They were known in antiquity. They have volcanic landscapes, and volcanic islands can rise, collapse, and be reshaped by catastrophic eruptions. But the geology creates a major obstacle. The Azores and Canaries are real islands, but there is no evidence that a continent-sized landmass sank beneath the Atlantic in human history. Plate tectonics does not work that way. Continents do not simply drop into the ocean over a single night of earthquakes and floods. Islands can collapse, coasts can drown, volcanoes can explode. But the disappearance of an entire Atlantic continent is not supported by modern geology. That does not mean sea level rise was insignificant. Far from it. At the end of the Ice Age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved inland, river valleys flooded, plains became seabeds. Communities living near ancient shores could have watched familiar land vanish, generation by generation, or sometimes much faster during storms, tsunamis, and sudden flooding events. That is enough to create powerful memories. You do not need a sunken continent to inspire a flood story. You need a coastal people who lose their homes. Beyond the Atlantic, proposals become even more ambitious. Some place Atlantis in the Caribbean, pointing to the Bahamas, Cuba, or underwater rock formations near Bimini. Others look to the Andes, Indonesia, or distant parts of the Americas. These theories usually begin with one feature that seems to fit: a submerged landscape, a strange stone formation, a great plain, an ancient catastrophe. But they often ignore the rest. A site might have circles. But does it have the right date? It might be underwater. But was it ever an inhabited city? It might lie west of Gibraltar. But is there evidence of a society with the scale Plato describes? It might have ancient ruins. But are those ruins actually ancient? Or are they natural formations, later buildings, or misidentified geology? This is the central rule of Atlantis research. You cannot solve the mystery by matching one detail. A convincing candidate has to fit chronology, archaeology, texts, and geology at the same time. The chronology has to work. If Plato's 9,000 years is taken literally, then the site must show something remarkable around 9,600 BCE. The archaeology has to work. There should be evidence of substantial settlement, social organization, trade, and the kinds of structures the claim requires. The text has to work. The location should make reasonable sense of Plato's references to the pillars, the sea, the plain, the mountains, and the political world of Athens and Egypt. And the geology has to work. The proposed destruction must be physically possible, supported by evidence, and dated to the right period. Most theories can satisfy one of those tests. Some can satisfy two. Almost none satisfy all four, and that may be the most revealing fact of all. Perhaps Atlantis was not a place waiting to be found on a map. Perhaps it was a story assembled from several real things: Western lands beyond Greece, Egyptian flood traditions, memories of drowned coasts, the disaster of Santorini, and Plato's own philosophical imagination. But before we decide what Atlantis was, we need a better way to separate possibility from proof. That distinction begins with three words that are often treated as if they mean the same thing. Possible, plausible, proven. They do not mean the same thing. Is it possible that people built settlements now hidden beneath the sea? Of course we know they did. Sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age, swallowing coastlines where human beings had lived for thousands of years. Is it possible that some prehistoric communities were more organized, more inventive, or more connected than older textbooks once assumed. Again, absolutely. Archaeology keeps pushing the story back. Monumental ritual sites, long-distance trade, skilled seafaring, and surprisingly complex hunter-gatherer societies have all appeared where earlier generations expected only small, isolated bands. But possible is the lowest bar. Almost anything that does not violate physics is possible. Plausible is harder. A claim becomes plausible when it fits what we already know about the period. The population levels, the available technology, the environment, the patterns seen at comparable sites, and the way human societies usually leave traces behind. And proven, or at least strongly supported, is harder still. That requires evidence that can be tested by other people, evidence that survives skeptical examination, evidence that does not depend on one blurry image, one dramatic coincidence, or one ancient sentence interpreted in the most exciting possible way. This matters because a civilization on the scale described by Plato would not be invisible in every direction. Imagine a large early state with cities, harbours, armies, temples, organised agriculture, trade fleets, and an empire extending across multiple regions. Such a society would produce enormous amounts of material evidence. It would leave settlements, not one mysterious structure, but layers of homes, workshops, storage areas, roads, defensive walls, trash pits, cemeteries, and rebuilt neighbourhoods. It would leave material culture, pottery styles, stone tools, metalworking debris, fishing equipment, jewellery, seals, weights and measures, imported goods. Evidence that ordinary people were making, exchanging, repairing, eating, burying and living. It would leave patterns. A true civilization is not just a spectacular ruin. It is a whole landscape of connected sites, villages feeding towns, towns linked by trade routes, quarries supplying building stone, fields or managed wetlands supporting large populations, ports connected to inland storage centres, smaller communities showing the influence of a larger political or cultural centre. And if that civilization had writing, as Egyptian records supposedly did, we should expect even more. Inscriptions, tablets, administrative marks, lists of goods, names of rulers, religious texts, boundary stones. Records do not have to survive perfectly, but large bureaucratic societies tend to create writing in quantity, and quantity increases the chance that something remains. Now, none of this means every lost society must leave a stone pyramid waiting to be excavated. Wood rots, reeds vanish, coastlines erode, rivers change course. Entire settlements can be buried under sediment or drowned beneath the sea. And underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and still limited compared with archaeology on land. So absence of evidence is not automatically evidence of absence. That phrase is true, but it is also often misused. If we have searched only a tiny fraction of an ancient coastline, then finding nothing proves very little. A discovery could still be waiting beneath mud, sand, water, or a modern city. But if a claim requires a vast empire, a huge population, advanced industry and influence across continents, then the absence of supporting evidence starts to matter a great deal. The larger the claim, the larger the footprint we should expect. You cannot claim a global civilization and explain away the missing ports, missing farms, missing tools, missing graves, missing trade goods, missing genetic impact, and missing records by saying that one flood destroyed everything. Disasters can destroy buildings. They do not usually erase every consequence of millions of people living across enormous areas. Dating is another test that sensational theories often avoid. A site is not evidence for Atlantis simply because it is old. It has to be old at the right time. Archaeologists use radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, tree rings, volcanic ash layers, luminescence dating, and other methods to establish chronology. None is magic. Each has margins of error and limitations. But when several independent methods point to the same period, that is much stronger than a guess based on how weathered a stone looks. And context matters just as much as age. A single object found out of place can be moved by water, trade, excavation mistakes, or later disturbance. A stone wall may be natural. A circle on a satellite image may be a geological formation, a modern field boundary, or an ancient feature with nothing to do with a city. The question is never, can this one detail fit Atlantis? The question is, what explanation best fits all the evidence? That is how future discoveries should be judged. Be open to surprise. Prehistory is full of surprises. Demand dates, demand excavation, demand peer review. Ask whether the claim explains the broader landscape better than simpler alternatives. Ask what evidence should exist if the theory is true, then look for it. Because the real past is already extraordinary. It does not need to be made smaller by skepticism, and it does not need to be made grander by fantasy. The challenge is to let the evidence lead us, even when it leads somewhere less dramatic than a lost empire beneath the waves. And that brings us back to the Egyptian priest at Sais. In Plato's story, he looks at Solon and delivers the insult that has echoed across 2,400 years. You Greeks are always children, not because the Greeks lacked intelligence, not because they had achieved nothing, but because, from the Egyptian point of view, Greek memory was young, broken, and repeatedly interrupted by disaster. Egypt had temples, priesthoods, king lists, rituals, monuments, and institutions that had endured for what seemed like unimaginable stretches of time. To a Greek visitor, Egypt must have felt like a civilization speaking from the edge of eternity. And Greek contact with Egyptian learning was real. Greeks travelled to Egypt. Egyptian art, religion, mathematics, trade, and political ideas influenced the wider Mediterranean world in different ways over many centuries. Solon himself may or may not have had the exact conversations Plato describes, but the basic setting is historically believable. A Greek lawgiver seeking old knowledge in Egypt is not an impossible scene. It is exactly the kind of thing that could have happened. But then comes the number, 9,000 years before Solon. If taken literally, it points back to around 9,600 BCE, near the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising, climates were shifting, and human communities were adapting to a rapidly changing world. That date is fascinating. It is not meaningless, but it remains unresolved. Was it an accurately preserved Egyptian chronology? A misunderstanding between Egyptian and Greek systems of counting, a symbolic number, a number reshaped by Plato because it served the scale of his story? We do not know, and that uncertainty is the key. Plato may have built Atlantis as a philosophical machine. A powerful, wealthy empire becomes arrogant. A smaller, disciplined Athens resists it. Then both are swallowed by catastrophe. It is a story about politics, virtue, ambition, and collapse. Atlantis is not merely a place on a map. It is a warning about what happens when power outruns wisdom. But philosophical stories can still be made from real materials. The Egyptian priests may have preserved memories of floods, lost coastlines, ruined cities, invasions, droughts, and generations of destruction. They may have carried traditions so old that their original events could no longer be separated from ritual, symbolism, and myth. A real disaster does not stay unchanged when it is retold for centuries. It becomes larger. Different events merge together. Places move, dates stretch, heroes appear, meaning takes over from accuracy. That is how memory works. So, could there be a historical shadow behind Atlantis? Yes, that is possible. Could Egyptian traditions have contained authentic memories of ancient catastrophes? perhaps even ones connected to the drowning of early coastal settlements after the Ice Age. Also possible, but is there currently evidence for a literal Ice Age empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, with the vast cities, armies and global reach described by Plato? No, not yet. And maybe that is what makes the question worth asking. Not because Atlantis gives us permission to believe anything, but because it forces us to ask how human beings remember the past when the evidence is incomplete. How myths can preserve something real, transform it almost beyond recognition, and sometimes obscure it completely. What do you think the Egyptian priests were preserving? History, mythology, a warning, or all three mixed together? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you are listening from. If you enjoyed this journey, like the video, subscribe to the channel and join the conversation below. And the best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.